Astonishing Legends would like to thank the Great Courses Plus, Lightstream, ZipRecruiter, Babbel, and our contributors at Patreon for making tonight's show possible.
Congratulations! You've made it to the end of our series on the Patterson-Gimlin Film. Tonight, as we always do, we close the series out with our own thoughts and conclusions on this astonishing legend. Those conclusions bolstered by the immersive dive we've taken into the subject over the past several weeks. But still, like all the topics we cover, we're just visitors. Many have spent their lives devoted to this research, and we don't pretend to have all the insights they do. Like many of you, when we began, we knew of the film, sure, but we hadn't given a lot of serious thought to its veracity. Scott and I both had our opinions, of course, but before we dive into the research on a subject, our opinions have no more value than anyone else's, really. They're sometimes based on nothing more than a cursory glance at the origins of a legend. However, when a series such as this one unfolds, it's a crash course in the topic at hand. There's nothing more exciting for us than that almost tangible feeling of ideas evolving within our minds on what may be at the root of a legend. And that excitement is what we hope to share with you. It's why we do the show, after all. But the more we research, the more we come to realize that you should never trust someone else's conclusions without digging deep yourself. The simple fact is, by now, you already know virtually everything we know about the Patterson-Gimlin film. If you've listened to every episode of this series, you can make an assessment right now. Trust your gut. Until this mystery is solved, there is no wrong answer. Beyond that, if you're interested in what we think after all the research we've done, well, then join us for this final episode on the Patterson-Gimlin film, and we'll tell you, as we're sure many of you expect us to. Bill Munns will say to you that the film itself is the best and only empirical evidence that matters in this story, and in many ways that's true. Evaluate the film and do so to a rigorous standard. He's done that. For some, that is the only thing that should be considered. Others will tell you that eyewitness testimony has little value, and in a criminal investigation, that's the prudent approach. But here at Astonishing Legends, we find eyewitnesses are often the most informative parts of a story, and of course, the most entertaining. Sometimes you have to determine if they're being honest or not, and even when they aren't, you can still use that testimony to inform your investigation. So for those of you that consider yourselves excellent judges of character, we've got a special treat for you tonight as we ramp out this epic series on the Patterson-Gimlin film. An interview with Bob Gimlin himself, the only living eyewitness to this story. You listen to Bob Gimlin, and you decide if he seems like an honest man with a clear recollection of this chance encounter in 1967. Because for us, the possibilities of him being involved in a hoax evaporated within just a few moments of meeting him.
Welcome back to Astonishing Legends. I'm Scott Philbrook, and this is Bob Gimlin.
And I just thought, oh my God, they really do exist.
Join us tonight for the conclusion of our series on the Patterson-Gimlin film.
And we're back.
Back in Bluff Creek, figuratively anyway. A quick announcement, speaking of being back, all kinds of coffee mugs are coming back into the store. Every color we've ever done before with the new distressed camping ceramic mugs is back. So some are in there now, more will be in there within the next week or two. So visit astonishinglegends.com and click on store to get to those if you're interested in them.
Yes, Scott hand distresses each and every one.
It takes hours.
Just because they're all identically stressed.
Yes.
But after you do that, hit your favorite app store and download Himalaya. It's a podcast player and aggregator that has finally gotten things right when it comes to ease of use and playback. It works on whatever you're using.
Yeah, once you download it, your first order of business is to find Astonishing Legends and give us a follow. Just search for Himalaya in your app store. It's a free download.
Okay, time to get to our conclusions.
Yeah, well, in looking at the stuff we have to say, I think maybe you should go first.
All right, I just have a few quick comments.
If it's only a couple of quick comments, why is the fan on my laptop going crazy when I pull up your outline?
That's because of all the repeated points I made. Yeah. Again and again.
This is it. This is the episode we've been waiting for. This is the last episode of the Patterson-Gimlin Film series, which has been a monumentally epic series for us. I was expecting it to be a multi-parter, but it really blossomed.
For 1 minute that we aren't also glad that it is ending. So, yeah, it's been a long, wild ride, much like the whole show. But, we felt it was important. And I don't think it is self-indulgent that we went on this long because this is the whole story. I felt that if we'd left any part out, like the scientific analysis, or just really pared it down so it's, each thing is just 5 minutes or whatever, you're really missing it because in some sense, people are like, who cares? I'll never like this subject. I'll just wait till you do a ghost story.
There are people that are, and I know because I've read their posts on Facebook, they are completely skipping this entire series.
Yes, and that's fine. Like I said, just go shop one of our sponsors in the meantime and enjoy the fine wares we have to offer and services.
Yeah, you can find those, even if you're not listening. Of course, this is
Right.
They're not going to hear this, so there's no point in saying
That's
it.
true.
You can find the sponsor links on the webpage.
That is correct. Yeah, no, I know people are skipping over this, and that's fine. There's things I do in shows that I enjoy where it's just like I'll come back a little bit later.
Yeah.
Still love the show. But I think if you like paranormal stories in general, this is an example of one of the best documented, analyzed, scrutinized, gone over with a fine-tooth comb cases of at least visual evidence ever for anything strange like this.
It is, and I honestly was surprised how much information we found when we started digging on this. I didn't expect this much information, or I might have said, let's do this later.
Yeah.
Well, but it's been such a revelation, and there's so much, it has really held my interest. I've had a personal passion for this topic that was unexpected for me.
Right.
And so I've really enjoyed this series. Yes, I'm ready to move on to the next thing. That's part of what we like about our shows. We get to explore lots of different things, but I've really had a good time on this, and it's been amazing to discover everything that we've learned on the course of this journey.
Yes, I think we experienced something that we hoped many of our listeners do when they hear a series like this from us, is that you go in thinking you know something about the story, and then you learn there's so much more to it, and it's a pleasant and interesting surprise in that you get your eyes opened. And for us, like I said, this is a story we've grown up with the story, always being around, and you have it in the back of your mind. But when you really look at it, it's like the film is the data. It's the implications of it, which are surprising, which we did not consider before until we started looking at this. So we get a great joy when people tell us, it's like, I thought about this subject before, and I thought like, I had that figured out, or I read some articles years ago, and it ain't much of nothing. But then you hear our coverage on it, it's like, wow, that was really fascinating. I never thought that about this, subject X. That's really rewarding to us, and I hope for the listener as well.
All right. Well, here's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to talk a little bit about our final conclusions, and we're going to have some debate about that. We've also written out some sections that we put a lot of thought into based on everything we uncovered as we went through this series. And then we're going to finish out the entire series and the end of tonight's episode with an interview with Bob Gimlin himself. It's not a monumentally long interview. It was very late at night. We only had about a half an hour with him, but we did get to ask him some interesting questions. Forrest, I love what you've got here in terms of your conclusion thoughts. I'd like you to go ahead and dive into this, and I'm going to interrupt you as much as possible.
In the middle of every word and sentence.
No, I'll try to
That's
be good.
fine. No,
right.
Go ahead and raise questions. I just wrote this out because, as we were going along here, it's not as well written as I'd hoped, but it's a conversational show. So these were thoughts I was jotting down as we've been doing our research, and I didn't really start writing them out until a couple of days ago, I think, or really an hour ago. So the idea, though, is that these are just some philosophical type thoughts that have been going through my mind about the film and the subject, and mostly, what it means to me, but also to the world, if this thing is real or not. So first off, the most general and basic thing I can say about the Patterson-Gimlin film is that, to me, it has always looked more real than fake. Even when I was a kid, I grew up watching all those movies and TV shows from the era, ones that had a guy in a monkey suit or a gorilla suit and were done by Hollywood special effects masters of the day, the ones that we just discussed. And the creature you see in the Patterson-Gimlin film looks at the very least as good, and in my opinion, better than what you see in those professionally produced suits, especially considering all the conditions under which the PGF was shot. Now, granted, there are things that are problematic with comparing the PGF to a professionally produced motion picture or television show. You have to consider that the PGF is only a minute long and is shaky for half of it, whereas film and TV creatures are on screen for much longer and therefore easier to scrutinize, but also harder to maintain a convincing performance. Also, some of the best that I've seen, like Rick Baker's fabrication and performance of King Kong in 1976, was pretty convincing, I thought, as were the apes in 2001: A Space Odyssey. But also keep in mind that those were more traditional apes, and it appears that Patty in the PGF is something altogether different, although similar to humans and apes. So for Roger Patterson to have accomplished this feat, he'd have to be as good or better than the best in the motion picture and TV industries, the best of the best who were producing anything like what Roger Patterson had pulled off. And Patterson was clever enough to add a few distinctive elements from a more advanced zoological knowledge of higher primate or ape anatomy than the average person knows. So he must have done his homework or really researched it. Things like adding breasts or a sagittal crest, human-like hands and feet, and especially the compliant gait, the walk of a higher but not quite human primate. That has kept experts, academic experts, movie experts, guessing ever since. So bravo to Roger Patterson for creating one of the best hoaxes in the history of all hoaxes, let alone a hoax of a paranormal event. Now, I will agree that using the film alone as evidence on an empirical basis, one cannot rule out the possibility of a hoax. That's just logical to me. It doesn't exactly disprove, or there's not enough there to completely rule that out. So that's still on the table. But then there's the matter of probability, which is still there for me. Meaning, how likely is it that Roger Patterson could have hoaxed this, juggling all these conditions and elements? How probable is it that even if he had the means of huge sums of money or just enough money for a guy that never had much money to begin with to make this kind of suit and get all this together, and then he has to have an untrained yet expert level skill set in special effects costume making, that it's fooling experts, and then he had to find a guy, whether it's Bob Hieronymus or not, that most experts agree would have had to have worn a skin-tight suit to pull off the moving musculature that's seen in the suit. So all these elements have to come together for this to work as a piece of film that has still baffled people for 52 years. So it's just happenstance that all these things came together to make this incredible piece of footage just by chance or luck in that one shot, that one take, as far as we know. Not bloody likely. That's my thinking about just, the possibility, the probability that Patterson could have pulled this off, by himself anyway. And even if he had help, it still seems very unlikely to me.
It would have had to have been a sophisticated level of help that it doesn't seem like he would have had access to.
And that's what I meant earlier when we were looking at David A. Daegling, the anthropologist, his book and his conclusions. It's like, well, I can't argue with that. You cannot rule out a hoax based on this film alone. But then you have to look to, then how was it done? What are the likelihoods that this thing could have been pulled off by anybody? And did Roger happen to find people who could do that if it wasn't him? Because, there are famous photos and footage of UFOs, of ghosts and other cryptids, but what, at least visual evidence, has been able to stand up to such rigorous examination by scientists after all these years, for coming up on 52 years, and it still stands up? Because other paranormal evidence has either been too vague, so it leaves too much to question and doubt, or it's been able to be debunked. But the Patterson-Gimlin film has not been able to be absolutely debunked, only doubted.
Right, and that doubt is born not based on the empirical evidence of the film, but just human nature, the people that doubt it, because of their inability to accept the possibility that it's real. It's not based on the film itself. In my opinion.
Right. I have a few thoughts about that here in a little bit, but for those who don't think it's evidence at all, I disagree with those like Greg Long who say this film isn't evidence. I mean, you could say it's not enough evidence for your tastes, or you don't like the evidence, but it's still a piece of evidence. It's just visual evidence. If you don't buy it for whatever reason, then you discount it. It's easy to say that it's not evidence. If the best you can come up with is that it just looks fake to me, or I think it's a guy in a suit, that's fine. Nothing can alter your perception and personal judgment if your mind is made up. But I would say that stance is not based on a reasonable examination of all the factors this film provides. So get the picture out of your mind of current CGI creatures we're all so used to, and go watch some films from the late 60s and 70s that had guys in ape suits and make that comparison. Because, now I think we have been visually accustomed to see that. But imagine if you were back in 67 and you did see something like Ready Player One, where King Kong is in the film and it's CGI, but it looks pretty real. You would have freaked out.
Yeah.
You're not used to seeing that. That would have blown your minds. But back then, we had a standard that was not that high. It was a guy in an ape suit. There was no CGI. Now, it was, King Kong, of course, there were miniatures used, there were matte paintings used, but it was Rick Baker in a suit.
Yeah, and you know where we were at. For those of you that are Trekkers and you watch the original Star Trek series and the famous scenes that were shot at Vasquez Rocks, which is just 40 minutes from here.
That's right. Yeah.
A million scenes have been shot there, but the one where Kirk fights the Gorn.
Oh, I love it.
And the Gorn,
sure.
like the lizard guy, and they have to make weapons out of what they find. They have to MacGyver it, or they're on the planet.
He's just got a sharp stalactite or
right.
something.
That costume, the Gorn,
Yeah.
It's 1967, same year.
Yeah.
Think about what that looks like and think about what Patty looks like.
That's my earlier point that I made here, is that if Roger pulled that off, it was, in my opinion, better, but probably in most opinions, as good as something you would see done by the best professionals in the business, because who else is making fake ape suits out there?
Right.
And is good at it?
Right.
Movie and TV professionals. That's who's doing that. So either Roger would have had that done for him, but I hope we cleared that up in our last episode here about motion picture special effects experts weighing in on this.
Sure.
So in that regard, something I would invite people to do is go find a really good, clean version of the film and really examine it. Watch it a bunch of times and look at all the muscle groups flexing in the movement, the fur and the face. And, as she turns her head, and you might notice some things you hadn't previously, because I think even Scott, when we started this, he was like, I don't see any leg flexing or any of that, the hematoma business. I don't really see that. You've looked at it a few times now. Have you seen anything more that's kind of surprised you about it?
Yeah, I have actually. I've seen considerably more. The other thing that's really cool is that Bill Munn sent us the 5K resolution scan that he did of frame 354, as he calls it, because it's not really 352. And when you look at that, you can see all kinds of things. And we have that frame posted with this episode in full resolution. But it is just astonishing, and I'm not doing that on purpose. Yeah. But it really is, to see all the detail and understand it. It's just the glory of film, which is sad to me that film is mostly dead and gone these days.
Yeah.
But
and we brought this up earlier, but when you look at it, especially online, you have to realize that the people who have seen all these things that you can't see, they're looking at much better, earlier, first generation copies, probably, of the PGF.
Right.
And so they are seeing detail that we can't possibly see. But with the help of Bill Munns, he's been able to restore a lot of that. But out there in the zeitgeist, that's not what people are mostly familiar with. They're familiar with these really bad multi-generational copies where the grain is huge and the definition is low. So that's what we're mostly used to. But if you go back and you look at it, though, it's weird. And then one thing that I think it was a late night, Scott and I were texting, and I just said, well, what do you think of that? He's like, it's kind of unsettling.
Yeah.
It's a little scary and strange.
Yeah, it is.
Well, now I'd like to talk about the question of Roger Patterson's character. Because regarding any attempts to question his character, you need to keep in mind that logically, none of that really matters. Even if Roger Patterson had been jailed many times previously for being a con man, or ripping off investors with staged hoaxes, or outright stealing and cheating, it only shows a propensity, a likelihood, or maybe just a motive for staging a hoax, but it doesn't disprove what was actually captured on film. It's like when a judge tells the jury they must disregard a defendant's prior crimes because while it may show a pattern, it doesn't prove the current crime being tried was committed by them. That does shade my opinion anyway, and I've heard that. I've been on a jury. It's like, well, I want to hear what this guy did before because he didn't it looks a little shady here. And it does affect people's opinions, obviously.
Well, what I always think about, too, is how Roger said, I'm probably the worst person this could have happened to.
Yeah,
He knew what he was.
Right.
And then to have this real thing happen, and we make a lot of references to, and will continue to in this conclusion episode tonight, to Jose Chung's From Outer Space, one of the greatest X-File episodes of all time. But there's a lot of common ground between what may have happened here and that episode of the X-Files.
Absolutely. Because Roger Patterson, he could have had Bob Hieronymus dressed up in an ape suit with Bob Gimlin standing by, ready to shout action and shoot a hoax just out of the frame. Like I said, the camera's pointed, maybe 90 degrees the other way. But then a real Bigfoot like Patty comes strolling by.
Yeah.
And that hoax in progress wouldn't discount what was captured on film. Because if Roger Patterson had even previously been caught hoaxing Sasquatch encounters on film, it doesn't discount the PGF, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
Now, if that was the hoax, then you have to go back to looking at the thing that's in the film. Because, remember, much like the boy who cried wolf, sure, the first 2 times he was lying, but that third incident about which the boy was crying actually had a wolf in it.
Right.
It wasn't all made up. And of course, you can compare that, but it's entirely possible, if you believe that something like this could exist, some kind of ape creature, that it was actually there, or there were fake footprints and real footprints there, whatever it was. But regarding his character, what you believe about Roger, it's immaterial, because you'll notice that none of the scientists or special effects costume makers who have weighed in on the PGF, either for or against, people with much more expertise in this subject than most all of us, none of those experts have brought Patterson's character into their analyses, assessments, or conclusions. And there's a reason for that. It doesn't matter.
In a world of questionable sources, here at Astonishing Legends, we strive to bring you, the listener, the most accurate information we can.
Well, that sounded a tad formal, but you're right. Believe it or not, we don't like to just iPhone it in. We want to give you the most accurate information on a topic that's out there. The Great Courses Plus is your best source of knowledge in just about any field, from ancient history to exoplanets.
The Great Courses Plus has professors and experts who've won awards for their teaching ability, and it's all really relevant stuff to your daily life, because even if it's a subject like history, understanding it leads to understanding what's going on in the world right now.
That is so true. Take, for example, a country that's been in the news lately, Russia. If you really want to know why they're doing what they're doing, it helps to know their history. We've already learned so much just from the first lecture, A Russian Past, A Putin Future, from the course, Understanding Russia, A Cultural History. See, unlike Boris Yeltsin, who said Russia must never return to the past, but continually move forward, that wasn't the grand scheme of his chosen heir, Vladimir Putin. Putin's aim was to resurrect Russia to its former historical glory by creating an idealized pre-Soviet empire and world superpower.
And the early beginnings of that empire might be traced back to the mid-9th century, when Scandinavian merchant warriors, or Vikings, known as Varangians, took notice of the trading region on Europe's northeastern edge. The East Slavs that settled there implored these Varangians, then known as the Rus, to restore order and rule over them, and in return, profit from the trade and rich resources of the area. The leader of the Rus, a warrior known as Rurik, took them up on their offer, and within a generation, an organized state called Kievan Rus was established.
Ah, Rus, Russia. Get it? See, start getting the right answers about the world around us, or just start learning about the things you're interested in, like writing, cooking, or photography. All at the Great Courses Plus today, because right now, they're offering our listeners a free trial of unlimited access to their entire library. But you can only access this offer now by signing up through our special URL.
Start your free trial today. Sign up at thegreatcoursesplus.com/legends.
That's thegreatcoursesplus.com/legends.
Hi, I'm Lucas from North Carolina, and you're listening to Astonishing Legends with Scott Philbrook and Forrest Burgess. And now, back to the show.
So I'd say logically, you still have to go back and address the film. What is it that was caught on film? Something else to keep in mind is that no one has argued that the film itself has been faked. Only the subject in the film. So that's interesting, because most of the time you see now with ghosts or UFO photos or whatever, or even ghost photos from the 60s and 70s, like, it's a double exposure. You can go way back.
Yeah.
And people are saying that's particular to ghosts. And they were doing that in the 1890s and turn of the century with all the spiritualism going on, ectoplasm and whatnot. People were faking photos because there was money in it. And then UFO stuff, there's fame. I don't know about money. I guess maybe some people sold some books off of that, but people were faking UFO photos. And many of those have been found to be fraudulent. But nobody said that about the PGF. Nobody said, oh, he stuck that in there, or it's an optical illusion, or it's an optical trick, like we talked about before, where you can affect the film with special effects or optical printing, as they say. So no one stuck a Bigfoot in there.
Right. By the way, compositing something like that is incredibly difficult, but it's also even more difficult when you've got foreground elements passing in front of the object, which is what's happening in this film. Right. I mean, even today, that's a pain in the butt.
Oh, absolutely, sure. Yeah. But think about this. This would be a whole different story if Roger Patterson had just come back with a story about encountering a Sasquatch, like so many that he put in his book. They're just tall tales or stories, that people can believe or not. They're easy to dismiss. But if he'd even come back with some plaster castings, well, knowing his background, or if you knew him or reading Greg Long's book and he suddenly came forward with a story, it's like, okay, sure, that story is now easier to dismiss because, yeah, maybe he is trying to pull one over on us and sell some books or whatever his huckstery kind of thing's going on. But he came back with something that's largely unexplainable on motion picture film, something people have been clamoring for when hearing just stories or seeing plaster casts. Let's see a picture. Oh yeah, Mr. Smart Guy, with your story? Well, how about some film? Why don't you get anything on film that isn't blurry? Well, here it is. Well, even if you show an image, that's still not enough for many. They want a body, and I can understand that. It's freaked people out that there is film of something strange that even experts have trouble defining or going through step by step and debunking. And it's the same way, ironically and interestingly, much like Chris Murphy said. Conversely, if you're a believer, then you just don't want a story about a costume that some guy said, oh, where is it? Well, it was in my trunk. I was like, where's it now? I don't know. Yeah, I sold this suit to a guy. Well, let's see a similar suit, right? These were somewhat manufactured in larger
you didn't
scales.
Custom make this, right?
Right.
You didn't spend weeks and months custom making a bespoke suit for someone you never met across the country.
Exactly. It's been said by Philip Morris that was their standard gorilla suit used in various acts, and that Roger may have altered it a little. Well, let's see the base suit. Not years later. Let's see the one that you had then. Let's see a pattern. Then you just don't want a story of a costume. You want to be shown the costume.
You know what? This reminds me that we actually had a listener contact us a few weeks ago about the Philip Morris costume, and she did give us permission to read this on the air. So I want to read this email from her about this. Hello, gentlemen. My name is Clara Jean. I am a professional costume designer and technician, actually originally from Charlotte, NC, my home state. I want to send a quick note regarding the Philip Morris costume theory. When making a professional costume, especially for a large company like Morris, there are a number of steps you follow. The first step is to make a pattern, a number of shapes you cut out and sew together to create the costume like a blueprint. Patterns for professionally made costumes are cataloged. That way, if they ever need to make the costume again, they can. The fact that they were not able to produce a similar costume shows that they had no pattern. If they had made similar ones like they said, it would just be a matter of pulling the pattern and you have an exact replica. It's a red flag to me that they cannot or have not done this. It's literally, all caps, the first step. So that's Clara Jean. Clara Jean, thank you so much for writing into us. Yeah. I just wanted to throw that in there because that's something about the Philip Morris costume, them not being able to produce one that specifically matches what Patty looks like. I'm not saying that they didn't make a costume. I'll be talking more about that later.
Oh, no,
that might have gotten used. But that specifically, they have not produced one that looks like Patty at all, not even remotely.
Right. And my hypothesis on that is that absolutely Philip Morris sold top shelf ape and gorilla suits. I believe that they went to a lot of magicians, and I firmly believe that he didn't really want to say anything maybe because of that magician's code. And I also think that he had a suit that did not match what Patty looked like in the film. And that's why it never came out right away. That's possibly another reason, and also another reason why he never produced a suit for people to see when he made that claim. Because it didn't exactly look like Patty. Now, there's two things about that. He did make a suit, remember, for that documentary that was going to be shot, I think, by National Geographic. I mean, that was a long time ago.
Yeah.
In our memories, it was
Yes,
a long time
yes.
ago. And they said it looked nothing like the film.
Right.
And he's like, well, I didn't have enough time. And I think it maybe ties in with something in a professional sense, like with Stan Winston and Rick Baker poo-pooing the suit. It's like, well, I could have done that. Or that guy could have done that for a couple $100. Or it looks really cheap and fake. Conversely, when Philip Morris saw it, it's like, that looks pretty good. I don't mind being associated with that. And that's pure speculation on my part, but I'm going off of the facts that he did provide a suit to be filmed in a documentary as a recreation, and it was not up to snuff. And so he had to go back to the drawing board, so to speak. There are pictures of him later in life, as we had one on our website here that we got from a blog, where somebody met him and he had a suit and it had the breasts on it.
Yes.
And the mask. And it does look more like Patty, but not exactly the same. I think that was years later made to at least have something.
Yeah. I don't know if they still do, but they had it on display in the store. You know, it was an object of interest.
Right.
It was their relic, their version of a relic.
Right.
And they needed to have some, especially if they're going to be connected to that story, and it brings a lot of business in and more power to them. And again, as you'll hear from me here when it gets to be my turn, which seems like it's hours and hours away, but you'll hear you'll hear that I still think there was a costume. I think the Philip Morris company is telling the truth. I just think that the costume they were talking about and Patty do not intersect.
Me too. Yeah, of course they had costumes. I don't think it was exactly what you see in the film. And I think that's why you never saw one being provided as evidence until much later. And even then, the one provided does not fit the bill for me as being the one, or even close to what you see in the film. It's closer. It's not exactly the same. Plus, you still have to have somebody with that build. It's a bulky suit, but you still need a big person with those ginormous shoulders that are 2 feet wide. Okay, well then, what is it on the film? Now, if Patterson had filmed an actual gorilla in the woods, it would be a totally different story. It would be a very weird story, but it would be something that we could all wrap our heads around and be able to ask more comfortable questions. I mean, sure, it looks like an ape, but where did it come from? Did it escape from a zoo? How did Patterson get a hold of one to film? Or why is a gorilla out in the woods by itself in Northern California, unsupervised? And how is a tropical animal going to survive the harsh winter? These are all comfortable, normal questions. Animals escape the zoo all the time, and we usually think it's kind of funny, especially when they're monkeys or, apes, because they're like us, but they're silly. We love them. But here's the key element. A gorilla is an animal we've all seen and we know and we love, and we certainly know what people look like. See, I think the problem here, though, is that people have with Bigfoot being real, maybe one of the most difficult of the paranormal topics to accept. I think the problem people have with Bigfoot being real is because Sasquatch is so close to human beings. And I didn't really know people had that much of a problem. I mean, that's one of those things that you hear people will go on about or state, well, I think UFOs and aliens, why not? We certainly don't seem like we'd be the only ones in the universe. Bigfoot, no way.
Yeah.
Not going there. Or ghosts, like, yeah, I think my mom saw a ghost. Or I saw something strange. I think there's something out there. I don't know what it is. But a big ape in the woods? No, that's not happening. That is something that I kind of learned with that interview with Rob Christofferson did on his show, Our Strange Skies, with John E.L. Tenney. We mentioned that before. Kind of anecdotally, he would, at his talks, ask people to raise their hands, like how many people believe in UFOs, and more than half of the audience, and how many people believe in ghosts, and even more, how many people believe in Bigfoot? 4.
Yeah.
It's just an odd thing, but I think there's a reason for it. Because again, wild ape, no problem. Wild missing link type ape, that's maybe one step below us on the evolutionary scale, big belief speed bump. And equally problematic whether you believe in creation, evolution, or a combination of both. But this type of creature shouldn't exist, right? I mean, that's according to what we've all been comfortably taught. And I think that's kind of what's going on here. But really, what's the big deal? There are 2 ways to look at Bigfoot that have to do with its origins or where it currently comes from. Either as a type of previously uncatalogued but natural woodland ape that is just extremely elusive, or it's a type of woodland ape that maybe comes from another dimension or something very woo-woo. If it's just an uncatalogued type of higher primate, even if it has better cognition than a regular run-of-the-mill gorilla, then it's just an animal, right? I mean, that's what it is. It's an animal. It's not a big deal. What is the big deal then in believing it's real? It's not like Sasquatch is the Flatwoods Monster, a robot ape, the Jersey Devil, or Mothman, or some kind of crazy hybrid chimera animal with the body parts of 5 different species, or even a chain-smoking wolfman from Skinwalker Ranch.
Love that guy.
It's just a type of ape. So why does the idea upset people so much? See, my hypothesis is that if it's real, this would make a lot of people have to question, where did we come from and how? And what else is out there that's this mysterious and strange and real? And if Bigfoot is real, what other strange creatures could also be real? Now, if Bigfoot is paranormal, that opens up a whole new set of problems. But interestingly, it also provides some answers. Well, not really answers, but it solves some of those problems of why don't you ever see one dead in the woods? Or where do they go? Where do they come from? And I find it kind of funny, but I also respect that, scientists I don't want to hear that. Do not bring up paranormal Bigfoot. I'm willing to go so far as that it is an undiscovered type of ape, but don't tell me it rides spaceships or
Bill
has
Munns
these,
is that way.
Yeah.
Bill Munns made
no.
a joke. I can't remember if it made it in the final cut of his interview, but he made a joke about I'm not, that has no. It's like, that's crap.
I know. Well,
he's a very empirical thinker, though.
Well, no, you have to be. And for this to be taken seriously at all, I can understand that argument where scientists, Grover Krantz saying those guys they just cause us so many problems.
Yeah.
We're trying to be taken seriously here. These are all very serious anthropologists and scientists and researchers. And then you have people coming in wanting to tie this in with UFOs and cryptids and all kinds of other strange things and all the lovely fun memes we see all the time. Disco dancing Bigfoot with shaking hands with an alien.
Yeah.
But there are many researchers who have found a connection between UFO sightings and Bigfoot sightings and ghosts and orbs and other cryptids and all kinds of strange phenomena. For example, in the Bridgewater Triangle area, that's been often reported.
That's in Massachusetts, right?
Yes, in the southern part of the state of Massachusetts, in an area that can be roughly mapped out between 3 cities, Bridgewater being at the northern part of it, I believe, where there's actually 3 small towns there's Bridgewater, Maine, and then Bridgewater East and West. And I believe that term was coined by Loren Coleman back in 1983 with his book that came out, where he was compiling all these strange stories. And you get the gamut of UFO sightings with Bigfoot-like cryptids and strange orbs being seen. And it's a redheaded guy with a beard who's the vanishing hitchhiker instead of the usual lady in white.
Yeah, okay.
There's a mysterious swamp there. There's all kinds of stuff going on there, but everything under the sun is reported. So is that a hot spot? What's going on there? Same thing was reported by Linda Godfrey in her research in the Elkhorn, Wisconsin area and Beast of Bray Road, where there's a lot of strange phenomena. People will see a lot of the same things. So very serious paranormal researchers have made connections between overlaid phenomena happening, sightings of different stuff. So is there a connection there? I know that's way beyond the realm of actual physical anthropology or anybody wanting to take that seriously. And I can understand that. Like I said, we all have jumping off points.
Right.
You and I do. It's like,
when are we getting off this train?
It's like you get to a point where that's really weird. Okay, that's just stupid. I'm not going there. It's just your personal belief. But for the scientific community, I can certainly understand you can't regard any of that. But there are other researchers who are in these fields that do consider these other things, and they have found connections. So is it like a Skinwalker Ranch, a perhaps more magical area of the country like a northern Utah where this stuff happens? Or in this case, as we're talking about the Bridgewater Triangle, southern Massachusetts. Is there a connection? But it does make you wonder if there is a connection to something paranormal when you cover stories like the Ape Canyon incident with Fred Beck, which we talked about earlier in our series. And there are a few stories out there where Bigfoot seems to be impervious to bullets. But what happened that day that was actually kind of corrected from what Fred said later was that the day before the attack, they'd seen a Sasquatch, and one of the guys apparently shot it and was certain he hit it. Like a couple of times, I think in the back or in the side, but like basically center mass, that thing fell over the ridge. Remember, and they chased after it. And the guy was like, I'm pretty sure I hit it. I think even in the head. They go there and it either fell down into the gorge where it was carried away by the stream And that was one case where it was swept away. Or the second time after the attack, they see one, and I think Fred himself claims he shot one and was sure he hit it. But then they run over there and they see it running up the hill, like
Yeah.
a tremendous speed. If you believe Fred Beck. It's just strange because these people claim they shot them. There is the story of the encounter of the invasion at Chestnut Ridge, which is a Seth Breedlove Small Town Monsters film. Remember we talked about that one?
Yeah.
And that one was weird because that does involve some kind of UFO landing craft of some kind. And these were Bigfoot type creatures, you could say, but also had some werewolf properties to them. That's more like a Skinwalker Ranch thing. But what was interesting is that, again, if you believe the accuracy of the account by the people that were there, and also there was a law enforcement officer who was there on the scene who showed up. It was a guy, kind of a younger guy, farmer, probably in his 20s, I think, and then two neighbor boys who got so scared they ran off, but the guy had a gun, he had a rifle with him. And I'm not sure if he shot at them when the sheriff had shown up or the police officer, but he claims he shot it at these two things because they were starting to come onto his land. He claimed that he saw them kind of wave off the craft. There was a larger one, there was a smaller one. One waved, and then the craft like took off, like, we're good here. We'll just come back in 20 minutes, whatever it was. The craft takes off, so that's a connection made to the strange craft. And these things were large humanoid bipedal type of creatures, but there were some werewolf type properties, and then a bunch of other weird stuff.
Sounds a lot like a Wookiee.
It is
I mean,
very
it can
Wookiee.
fly a spaceship.
It's very Wookiee-like.
Yeah.
Yeah. One odd thing, again, who knows about these little details in these stories, but I love to remember them and catalog them in my brain here. But one of them is that he claims that he shot one, and he was, again, pretty sure he hit it. But he said that when he thought he hit it, it sounded like a stone dropping in water. Like it went blink.
Right.
The creature didn't react at all, but he's like, I'm pretty sure I hit that thing. And it just made a ploink sound, like bloop.
Yeah.
And he hit it a couple of times and it didn't seem to phase it at all.
Interesting.
So you wonder, is Bigfoot bulletproof? Well, of course, that's not something Krantz and Jeffrey Meldrum and all the other serious scientists want to even consider. And I understand that, but that's the kind of the fun part of it. I guess unless you're scared out of your wits and this thing's approaching and nothing seems to be stopping it. But that is one angle that some more, let's say, free thinkers have brought up to explain, where do they go? Is it someplace like another dimension? Or why don't we see dead ones? Why do they seem to just pop up? Like they show up and then they seem to disappear, even in the PGF. Yeah, they kind of came around that bend and there was a large stump about 8 to 10 feet tall, big overturned tree stump, and she was kind of behind it. But they did chase after her. And then again, we had a little bit of debate about this. How did she actually disappear into the brush? Because she's a big barreling creature. And I remember Bob Gimlin saying it just seemed like it just stopped. Whatever she was plowing her way through, whatever kind of dense brush was there, they saw that half footprint that was wet on that rock, like she'd rested her foot there or stepped on it, and then that was it. So it's odd. It makes you wonder, though, if you're open to that kind of thing. So anyway, that's part of it, but is it tied to the rules? Like, why don't we see them all the time? Or do we, and just not in a general public way? Because there's tons of reports. There continue to be so to this day, even past Ray Wallace and other hoaxers' claims. It continues to happen. So if it falls under the rules that we're not allowed to capture one, why is that? Why are we allowed to see this thing? And like so much other paranormal stuff, is it just enough of a glimpse to make us wonder and question this world? What's the purpose there? Or what is the rule? Who knows? So that's if you want to go to the woo-woo side here. But, one thing I will say that should be looked at, that we encountered with a lot of scientists, is that they won't even look at it. And I think it's compelling enough anyway to just look at the film, but it always boggles my mind when there are scientists who won't even just take a glimpse at it. I mean, yes, they're going to deny it after the first viewing, but there's some that won't even look at it. And it reminded me of, like those church officials who didn't bother looking into Galileo's telescope because they felt they didn't need to. I'm just telling you, you're wrong right now. It's like, well, yeah, just look to the scope. It's like, no, don't need to. Because I think that they were worried about what they'd find. That's a speculation on my part, but I think it's just like, it's like D.W. Grieve, I think was the mobility expert.
Mm-hmm.
He found it unsettling having to consider it, but he did at least take a serious look at it, and he was kind of uncertain or kind of on the fence about it.
Devil's advocate here.
Yeah, sure.
I think about Ed Primo, a
Mhm.
internationally recognized forensic audiologist, considering what was on our DR60, and what that EVP was. I would have gotten it if he'd have said, I can't get involved in that.
Oh, I understand. I mean,
he's
I think
a paid professional witness. Expertise is, when you cross that line, that's why I was thrilled that he agreed to take a listen to it and analyze it.
Absolutely.
So,
no, I laud him for that fact. And I just place my own curiosity there because it's like, if I was given something that's kind of way out there, like, look, I'm not going to go on the record and publish a paper that this thing is real, but I want to look at it.
Yeah.
I mean, let's see it. Because that's the way my brain works. Yeah, I'm not going to stand behind this or anything weird, but I'll look at all your fake ghost photos and your UFO pictures and stuff because I just find it interesting. And I can understand why an academic just won't even go there. I'm glad a few did, and I understand why most don't, but you just wish that they did, because I think the more people that weigh in on this, the more we can start to figure these things out or figure out what's going on, maybe. I don't know. And I know a lot of people out there don't care about Bigfoot, one iota, and are glad the series here is at an end. But consider this. If Bigfoot could be real, then what other strange creatures and mysterious wonders out there could also be real? That's that fear I talked about earlier here. And if only Bigfoot is real, then at least it shows that this world is a tad stranger than many of us are willing to consider. Bigfoot, I think if you consider what's on the table here, there are only two hoax possibilities that come forth so far, and that is Hieronymus and Morris. And to me, neither of those add up, and they certainly don't add up to each other. So then it's some other guy with an impossible build in a then impossible suit. But what I personally find interesting is that, even when I was a kid, I thought that it was likely that it was real. Growing up, that's my personal imagination. When I saw the film, it's like, wow, look at that. I don't know. You want to believe it, or it's fantastical and fun to believe that kind of stuff. But, you're a kid, you don't go much into it. And you just kind of hear the stories ever after about, oh, this guy claims he faked it, or this came up, or, scientists think it's a hoax, and you just kind of shove it aside. But you cannot keep that fun bit of hope alive that, like, well, maybe it is real. So what I found interesting here is that it wasn't until I was an adult, until we started doing this series, that I could fully grasp all the ramifications of the story, because I never really looked into it that closely either. You know what I'm saying? You hear about the stories and stuff would pop up in the news, and it's the same stuff we hear nowadays, except a lot more limited, mostly in print. And then we get here and we do a deep dive, and you consider all those things, and I can fully grasp that. And what happens is that now you start to consider the implications of that being real. And that's where the real fun was for me, and the real interesting aspect of looking into something like this is that, okay, what if this film is real? Then how do I have to change my thinking? Because the big shift here is not that if Bigfoot exists, because I've always thought that Bigfoot was possible in some way. I don't see what the big deal is about it not existing. I've always thought that was possible. But it's that if you were curious as to what one really looked like, you know what I'm saying? It's like you've heard of Bigfoot. It's like, geez, I wish somebody would have some good film of this, or I wish somebody would at least catch one. And if you can't catch one, somebody get a close-up with a digital camera or something, and we still haven't really gotten that. But this film might be the closest we get, because if you ever wanted to know what a Sasquatch really looks like and wish there was good footage of it, here it is. I'm sure we've all known people, if not ourselves, who've gotten into a little credit card debt at some point.
Have you?
Yeah, just a couple $1,000s worth. But, when I was in between jobs, and man, nothing felt better than finally clearing that off. It's like a great weight was lifted, or decluttering your place. But I do know people who've had like $40,000 or $50,000 worth of credit card debt, and that's a long-term nightmare, because it's a monumental task just paying off the interest without even touching the principal that much.
Oh, yeah. Have you folks out there checked out your interest rates lately? The average interest rate on credit card debt is over 19% APR.
Look, anybody can get themselves into a jam before they know it, but now anyone can get themselves some help getting out of that jam, because you don't need to be a financial expert to know that consolidating debt into a low fixed rate can save you thousands in interest. So why not pay off your high-interest credit cards with a credit card consolidation loan from Lightstream?
You can get a rate as low as 5.95% APR with AutoPay, much lower than the national average interest rate on credit card debt. Get a loan from $5,000 to $100,000 with absolutely no fees.
The application is 100% online, and you can even get your money as soon as the day you apply. Lightstream believes that when you have good credit, you deserve a low rate and great service.
And we're going to tell you about a special offer just for Astonishing Legends listeners. Apply today at lightstream.com/legends and get an additional interest rate discount. That's lightstream.com/legends for an additional discount. lightstream.com/legends.
Subject to credit approval. Rate includes 0.5% auto-pay discount. Terms and conditions apply, and offers are subject to change without notice. Visit lightstream.com/legends for more information.
What if you wanted to hire someone to wear a Bigfoot costume for a film you were making?
Will you stop with these impossible hiring scenarios?
Hey, we hired our friend Mark to play one for our Patreon video.
Oh, you're right. Well, we kind of lucked out because Mark is 6'3" and a pretty good actor, and he was available and willing. Also, he just worked for some pizza. But if you need someone to fill a position fast and you don't have a good friend willing to help you out, what you need to do is go to ZipRecruiter.com/legends, your one-stop solution where the hiring is simple, fast, and smart, and where growing businesses connect to qualified candidates.
Right. But what's often not smart is just hiring a friend or family member because you're in a bind and you just need someone fast, like we did with Mark. Because how much do you really know about how well they're going to fit your open position? And then when it doesn't work out, you're going to be in a really awkward and embarrassing position when you have to fire them.
Ugh, yeah, that never goes well. So why not hire the best candidate first and fast? That's what ZipRecruiter does for you, because ZipRecruiter sends your job opening to over 100 of the web's leading job boards. But they don't stop there. With their powerful matching technology, ZipRecruiter scans thousands of resumes to find people with the right experience and invites them to apply to your job.
As the applications come in, ZipRecruiter analyzes each one and spotlights the top candidates so you never miss a great match. In fact, ZipRecruiter is so effective that 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate through the site within the first day.
Don't get caught hiring any old ape in a suit, because right now, Astonishing Legends listeners can try ZipRecruiter for free at this exclusive web address, ZipRecruiter.com/legends.
That's ZipRecruiter.com/legends.
ZipRecruiter.com/legends.
ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire.
Hi, this is Lori from the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State. When I'm not chilling with a chai latte, chatting it up with Bigfoot, I'm listening to Astonishing Legends. Now, back to the show.
So we know it's been weeks and weeks, and before I get down to my conclusions on all of this, I thought it would be a good idea to revisit just the major players, just briefly, because there's really only 4 major players, in my opinion, in the original story. One of them is Roger Patterson, who was the man with the camera in Bluff Creek that day. Bob Gimlin, his friend, who was with him but did not have a camera but was an eyewitness. Then there's Al Diatley, who was involved in the distribution and the monetization of the film after it was made, who allegedly worked not only to make money off the film that Roger and Bob had shot, he also, according to Bob Gimlin, kind of pushed him out of the picture. We heard that from Gimlin himself. And then the other major player, in my opinion, there's a lot of people that have said things about the film and the likelihood of it being true or hoax or whatever, is Bob Hieronymus. You can't not have him at the top level here. He was a compatriot of theirs, a friend who had done stuff with them off and on over the years. And he claims, as we've said and pointed out, that he wore a suit and that it is him in the Patterson-Gimlin film.
Right. Now, before we progress any further, I think there are 2 gentlemen who are very deserving of mention here on the research and fieldwork side of this, and that would be John Green and Renata Hinden.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I'm talking about the actual participants in the event, but you're right. They absolutely do have an honorable mention at this point in the conclusions, of course.
Looking at the aftermath and trying to get data from it initially there, right in the field. Those guys were there and actually went to the site and measured out the footprints while they were still there. So,
Right.
yeah, but as far as talking about the players in the actual film and filming and the nitty-gritty of it, those are the guys right there.
Yeah, and we don't really know if Bob Hieronymus was part of that, but that's what we're going to talk about here in a second. He claims to have been a part of it, so he gets in the mix. Now, here's the thing about Hieronymus. We pointed this out. He actually passed a lie detector test on television where he said that he wore a costume, and it's him in the Patterson-Gimlin film. However, Roger Patterson also passed a lie detector test. So the question is, how can they both be doing that? Well, one is that lie detector tests are notoriously unreliable.
I think that's the big one here. Yeah.
But there's another possibility, and this is coming around to my conclusions, and that's that they're both telling the truth. And this is something that Bill Munns touched on in our interview with him. And I agree with his assessment, but I'm going to go a little bit deeper on it here. The first thing to consider is the anecdotal evidence. And what kind of value does anecdotal evidence have? Bill Munns himself said on our show just last week that anecdotal evidence is useless. And we agree that you can't quantify the value of it on its surface, but you can ascribe some kind of value to it when you take a hard look at the circumstances and the people involved in whatever story you might be covering. Now, if you keep an open mind, always consider the sources of your information, whether it's directly from an eyewitness or from someone who makes a living publishing what said eyewitness recalls about an event. That is a filter that you have to put on to any anecdotal evidence that you're taking into account. Now, anecdotally, in this story, there were only 2 eyewitnesses. Now, I think people tend to forget that, especially after all this time. Only 2 people saw this creature, Patty. One of them is dead. In fact, if Patty, or the person who played Patty in a costume, are dead, then Bob Gimlin, at 87 years old, is the only living survivor of this legendary event, of this meeting. So we have to go on Bob Gimlin's word at this point, and that's where we do the thing that we do, Forrest and I, at Astonishing Legends, in trying to evaluate the character of the man before we make a call. Who is Bob Gimlin? What is he like? Now, it turns out by sheer coincidence, shortly after we decided to greenlight this monumental series, YouTube paranormal host Jeffrey Gonzalez was having Bob as a guest for a long interview in Fresno just about a week after our first show in this series would be running. And we bought tickets to that. Fresno is only about 4 hours north of us. So we hopped in the car and we drove up there. And while we were there, and also I'd like to thank Jeffrey Gonzalez for just giving us free access to Bob and connecting us with Bob's current manager who's helping him with a tour that Bob is taking right now. And then also Bob, who graciously took some time at the end of this long interview, late at night, 87 years old, mind you, agreed to sit down with us and talk to us for about 30 minutes one-on-one.
Yes, that was a tremendously serendipitous and fortunate accident that we kind of tripped upon this interview that we could get to.
Yes.
And Jeffrey hosts his own show on YouTube called Paranormal Central. So he's got his own paranormal show. I think he's been researching in the field for about 15 years. And what I didn't fully realize is that Fresno is a hot spot.
Yeah, there's a lot of weird stuff going on in Fresno. And he's right there in the middle of it.
I didn't connect this actually until a couple of days ago. The Fresno night crawlers.
Yeah.
Fresno night crawlers. So they have their own night crawlers.
Yeah.
Walking pajama pants in the middle of the night on people's lawns. But it's a hot spot for all this activity. And there are tons of Bigfoot sightings there.
It's 11 p.m. Do you know where your jammies are?
They're walking towards Bigfoot to be slipped on for the night.
Anyway, getting the time with Bob was amazing too. And, coming back to the importance and difference between anecdotal and empirical evidence in a situation like this or a story like this is the problem with that phrase for us is the verses. We see them as forms of evidence that can work together. And we also believe that both have to be taken with a grain of salt because the pervasiveness of confirmation bias has equal powers in both categories. But the simple fact that we consider anecdotal evidence is what makes our approach to this subject and all of the ones we covered different. We think it's okay to take it into account as long as you do so with a critical eye and accept that it's also impossible to shut out what you want to believe. So that's where we're different. We never claimed we're only going to look at empirical evidence because when it comes to folklore and legendary encounters, 9 times out of 10, there is little to zero empirical evidence, and we have to go off the anecdotes. So in a way, we spend more time dealing with anecdotes and trying to suss out what's behind them. And, for me, one of the milestones in terms of our personal investigations, I don't want to go off on a tangent here for too long, but was, for example, the Jersey Devil story and the origins of the Jersey Devil and how we were able to tie that all back to a political fracas that connected to really just a lot of people talking smack about each other, which
Yeah.
may have actually led to the original idea of the Jersey Devil.
Yeah.
That's where you are really looking at anecdotal evidence and trying to piece together what actually happened.
Yeah, and people now make the connection to a tulpa theory, is that has this weird creature or elements of this legend that have been described for all these years come together in some kind of manifestation?
Right.
Maybe some things are being, not, I would say, totally physically, but maybe something implanted in the subconscious or conscious reality of ours that's being seen. Some, I guess you could call it a thought monster. of
Well,
sorts.
it's like the ghost. There was that one particular plantation, I can't remember now, but there was a ghost that actually appears in a photograph,
Mhm.
and they said, oh, that's so-and-so, I can't remember her name.
Oh, that's right. It's
and
not a real person.
The people are like, this person never existed, but
Yeah.
there's all these stories about her, and bang, here she is in a photo.
People say that about Bigfoot now, though, as well, that it's maybe a tulpa-like creature, in that it's been part of our stories and legends and lore since Native Americans were here on the continent, passed down to white settlers, and it's just become a part of the land. And when that happens, maybe these things manifest themselves somehow.
Again, that's out there. That's
Yes,
a little
that
woo-woo.
is both woo and woo.
Let's bring it back around now to empirical evidence and the idea of it. The thing about the Patterson-Gimlin film is that the PGF itself is empirical evidence. It is a tangible item that has been seen, copied, and analyzed. And last week, again, you heard from Bill Munns about all the work he's done on it. He has 35,000 frames of it stored at high resolution from every known copy. Anyone that thinks that there's anything to that film that Bill Munns hasn't seen and analyzed is kidding themselves. He is an expert on both the film, including all known copies and stills from it, as well as creature costume creation in Hollywood. Now, surely he would have seen something that's not right. Now, last week, you also heard Bill's conclusion. He's 1,000% convinced that the creature in the PGF is, quote, and I loved it when he said this, just as it appears. Meaning his belief is that Patty is an unknown cryptid and that the film shows her just as she is in the wild. And he'll be the first to tell you that rationally, he cannot reconcile her existence with the other lack of evidence pointing to it. He pointed out himself in our interview with him that no other film has ever been shot that is as convincing. No costume has been made that can mimic Patty, and as every skeptic knows, no bones and no bodies. Where are the rest of them? Even Bill had a hard time with those facts, but he is still positive that Patty is real. And on top of that, he doesn't care about the anecdotal evidence at all. He doesn't care about that evidence that I say we take into account. That evidence means nothing to him. He did not take 1 ounce of it into consideration for his conclusion. His conclusion is based on the film, not stories about people's character and personalities, not events that happened before or after the film, just those 954 frames of footage. The only thing left for him or anyone to do is to apply his principles of analysis to the missing original roll, which, although lost, we suspect there are those that know where it is. Now, I don't want to move on without giving a nod to the scientists as well. And Forrest, you did a lot of the legwork on our episode about all the scientists and their reactions. And if we take Bill out of the equation and we go to the scientists, what did they think? And we heard from them in part 4 the week before last. They had differing opinions. And correct me if I'm wrong here, Forrest, but the biggest takeaway is they had debates on little things like whether or not a human could mimic Patty's walk. Some said no way. Some said it would be easy. They debated the possibilities of that by debating the frame rate the film was shot at, which may forever be an unknown. Some saying that if it was this frame rate, a person could do it. If it was that frame rate, they couldn't. And that's something that we can't know because Roger's the only one that knew that. He's passed away, and the camera is a little imprecise in its frame rate settings. The only thing you can do is look at it and try to judge if the movement in it is natural or feels Keystone Copy sped up or slowed down.
Right. I believe it was either John Green or Renee DeHinden that said if you did project the film at 24 frames per second, which is one of the settings. And again, this speed dial on the camera does not have click stops.
Yeah, there's no notches.
It's a variable, right. So it's just numbers and a little notch, and you have to line that up.
Potentiometer.
Yeah, it's right. It's in the ballpark. And again, the camera itself fluctuates because it's I believe a battery operated or maybe a crank operated motor mechanism.
Yeah, I can't remember if it had.
I think it's crank.
I think it's crank. Yeah, I don't think it had batteries.
Yeah, no, I'm familiar with one of the area a little later in the 70s. The Canon Scopic had its own rechargeable batteries in the camera case itself at the top. And this one, I believe, was crank. So it's imprecise. but you can achieve a decent estimate that it's not 64 frames per second. It would look like it was in slow motion. It's not 24. It looks a little herky-jerky. Yeah, Keystone Cop-ish. So it's probably under 18 and below, because that would be one of the settings. So it goes to reason that at least Roger would have it somewhere on one of the numbers. But in either case, essentially what they were trying to determine, the scientists, was that at a certain speed setting, this walk is either achievable or not achievable by a human gaining that amount of distance. But it's all an imperfect data set. And what you end up with is some experts disagreeing with each other, even with the data. So you go back to that argument of even the scientists, even the experts will disagree with one another.
Yes, and for you kids out there who have no idea what we're talking about when we say the Keystone Cops, just Google it. Because it occurs to me that it is passing out of the zeitgeist and probably did maybe 20 years ago. We heard that many of those scientists had differing opinions on whether or not Patty was real, and they rooted these opinions in scientific analysis. But here's what we didn't hear. Not a single scientist said that the creature in the PGF was definitively a human being in a costume. I want to rephrase that. In 52 years of analysis with dozens of scientific minds looking at the Patterson-Gimlin film, not a single one stated that it was unequivocally a human being wearing a costume. In fact, the most often heard refrain was, if it's a hoax, it's one of the best we've ever seen.
And like a lot of the scientists and the motion picture special effects costume expert creators who gave a favorable impression of the film, all said the same refrain, is that if it is a costume, it's one of the best we've ever seen. And if this is a man in a suit doing a performance, it's spot on.
Yes, and most of the ones who said something contrary to that later retracted their statements after they were able to study it further, or after other people said to them, "Are you sure?" They said, "You know what? I don't know. I had nothing to do with it." Because there was rumors that some special effects guys, certain ones had something to do with it, others didn't. You can dig all that out of our series or the books associated with it, which we have links to. Now, the only person categorically stating that it was a man in a costume is Bob Hieronymus. He says he was there and that it's him, and that Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin were all in on it, and he'll even show you how he can walk like Patty appears to walk. Now, we've already gone over all the holes in Hieronymus's declaration. We discussed both the anecdotal and empirical evidence against it, but since this is the last part of the series, let's restate the empirical evidence one more time, or at least one fact of it, which is really all you need. Bob Hieronymus's joints are not in the right places to match the joints we see on the film. Therefore, he cannot be Patty. Casting aside all of his recollections about the event that simply do not align with the events at Bluff Creek, including how they got to the location, the nature of the costume, the idea that he wore street clothes underneath it, the list goes on and on. The simple fact is, if it was that easy, then it would be that easy to do it again. No one has. Many have tried. All have failed. I'd like to add that Bob Hieronymus did not make his claims to being the man in the costume until well after Roger Patterson had died and wasn't around to make a counterpoint to it. There are reasons that we know that Patty cannot be human. One is her arms are longer than her legs, which is more in common with primates than human beings. Human arms are 20% shorter than human legs. But what about arm extensions? Totally possible. But then how do you flex the fingers? Animatronics in 1967? I don't think so. The other thing is the length of the lower leg from the knee to the foot. Also the length from the knee up to the hip joint. This is not something you can fake. Look at a stilt walker. You can make things longer or maybe bigger, but you cannot subtract from the human body. Therefore, the only way you could successfully fake Patty's build would be to use a mime whose body type was highly unusual, perhaps a partial amputee in the case of the legs, or someone with an unusually shaped head to accommodate the drastically receding forehead above the brow line. If you're going to have somebody with a forehead that is common to all of humanity, then you would have to make the head huge to give the appearance of the receding forehead, which is something that Bill Munns talked about last week. So my question to you is, if you think it's a hoax and somebody in a costume, how likely does it seem that Roger Patterson found a partial amputee with a receding forehead, a differently shaped head that would fit into Patty's costume? By the way, does that sound like Bob Hieronymus? No, that's not what he looks like.
This goes under what we said before about the scientific objective conclusion about all this, which I believe is rational, and that a hoax or a man in a suit as a possibility cannot be ruled out. But you have to now look at the probability. Then Roger Patterson got somebody to be in this suit but it doesn't look like it was Bob Hieronymus.
Right.
So then where is this really oddly shaped person that's massive? Because in some physical morphology aspects, according to Grover Krantz and others, that this thing is even larger than Andre the Giant in upper chest proportions. So it's going to be somebody very special.
Right.
And then where are they?
And then when you come to the holes in the story, according to the skeptics, there's the one thing that seems to come up the most is how did the film get processed? They're all obsessed with this timeline on the film processing. I think we've shown fairly that it could have been processed off the books. Al Diatley, who was a wealthy man, may have bribed somebody to do that on the weekend, and he chose to protect their job and identity by not saying who they were. Again, we covered the idea that it may have been some kind of off-the-books lab and that those places existed, even specifically in Seattle, where the film was processed.
Right. So now we're looking at the converse of that argument earlier about keeping open the possibility of somebody in a suit hoaxing the thing. We also have to keep open the possibility that it's possible that they did have the film processed in time for that showing, between them filming it and getting it to Seattle and that first showing. So that's not been ruled out or been debunked. It's possible that that could have been done. It's a tight turnaround.
It only took an hour, though, to process the film. Once the machine is up and running and you want to process it, it's 1 hour to get it processed.
1 hour photo.
The other thing that skeptics get hung up on is the changing details in the story of events. And this is a thing for me. This comes back to how anecdotal evidence works. It's a story that's been told for over 50 years now about 1 minute of their lives. 1 minute that would define everything they would do from that moment forward until they die, until they leave this world. It's a minute that likely sent both Roger and Bob Gimlin into varying stages of shock, if you believe it wasn't all hoaxed. And I'll just say this about that idea. I don't know Roger other than what we've read about him, but I've met Bob, and I would say between the two of them, he's probably less likely to be in shock than Roger because Bob is cool as a cucumber.
Well, he is a very experienced, always has been throughout his whole life, outdoorsman and tracker and hunter and horseman and a fearless man of adventure and the outdoors. And when he talked about not being able to find Patty or track her back into the woods, or he had to stop at some point because, like I said, the thick underbrush seemed to be unaltered at some point, and he just gave up. Plus, Roger was back there, so he couldn't make his way through the brush. That's an odd thing when he says, well, it kind of stopped being trackable at some point. And also another thing that he said to us offhand was that people always say to him, well, then where are the bones? And he says, well, if you've been out hunting, something that a lot of hunters and outdoors people will tell you is that large animal carcasses don't stick around very long in the woods. So Bob made a point to us. It's like, yeah, I've, very rarely come across a large animal carcass unless it's been freshly killed. A large deer that's been killed or just died. Because soon after that, there will be a lot of small critters and scavengers that will make off with the meat and the bones.
Dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return.
Or
pretty quickly in the woods.
Snacks, yes. To be distributed evenly. Or I think we've said this before, maybe they're smart enough and have enough custom to bury their own dead, or at least hide them somewhere. We don't know, or maybe they vanish, but...
Well, we've already found, and you can look at Werner Herzog's films that have come out, The Cave of Forgotten Dreams, and there's been other caves since then. We found caves with bodies in them that have been sealed up for tens of thousands of years.
Yeah.
That's just something to consider when you're thinking about where, like you said, if there's a sentience to these things, if they're real, about where the bodies go. And then, of course, there's your whole thing about how they jump on a ladder on a UFO and just...
I did not...
They fly away.
The point is about just as an animal, though, or even an ape, if they are closer to humans, well, there's been evidence that Neanderthals, which are much closer, of course, to humans, very, very human-like, not so much ape-like, that's a fallacy. There's evidence that they did bury their dead with, I believe, flowers and plants around them. So where are the bones? We don't know. Maybe we've just not discovered them if they have been buried carefully or hidden. And as far as the scat or hair or other physical evidence which people are asking for, well, people have claimed to have found some of those things. I don't know how conclusively they've provided a match to something that's unknown DNA-wise, but I would say most of the time, if people have come across poo or hair in the forest, they don't know that from a deer, bear, or Bigfoot. And so, unless you're out collecting it. Again, some people have claimed that, and of course it turns out to be deer hair or moose hair or something, or horse hair a lot of times. But people have claimed that they've got samples and it's in various states of being processed. One thing Jeffrey told us is that it's very costly to do this. So it's not done very often, especially by people who don't care to do it in the
To
first
analyze,
place. I think.
yeah, that kind of
Nobody's
stuff,
really gathering behind this to push it through in the scientific community to get it analyzed. So it just sits there in a Ziploc baggie somewhere.
Well, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy of ignorance because the scientific community is refusing to look at these things. So as a result, they've never been studied properly.
Yeah.
So what they're going to do is say it doesn't exist. There's no proof of it, while at the same time refusing to analyze any possible proof that's been produced for analysis.
I talked about Mark Evans, Dr. Mark Evans, up in the Himalayas in the National Geographic documentary, I believe, where they took DNA from a high altitude pool where there shouldn't be any type of ape creatures. And they came back with a DNA sample that was 99% human. What do you do with that? That's not a picture. That's not footage of this thing. It's just that you know now that there's something out there very close to being human, but not quite. So if we found something out in the woods and it came back like, well, we found some poop and it's 99% human, it's like, that's not going to be enough for people who are claiming they want physical evidence.
Right.
And that's the only way that a lot of people are going to be satisfied is if you come back with a body.
It's that time of year again when people are starting to plan their vacations.
Yes, and many of them to some exotic foreign destinations where the locals speak an ancient, mystical language, like Europe.
Okay. Well, if you're going on vacation in a country where English isn't the main language, there's no reason to be worried that you'll be spending the whole time bumbling around lost and looking for people who speak English, just so you don't end up at the wrong attraction or ordering some strange food you won't like.
That's right, because with the Babbel app or going to babbel.com, you can learn enough of the language of the place you're going to that you're bound to have a more rewarding and enjoyable experience. Because Babbel's teaching method has been proven to be effective across multiple studies, and the lessons have been lovingly created by over 100 language experts who are real people, not by a translation machine. And this means Babbel will have you quickly speaking a new language with confidence within weeks, not months.
And because Babbel is available online or as an app, you can take it with you wherever you go and keep learning. Even take it with you on your trip. It also couldn't be more convenient because the lessons are only 10 to 15 minutes, and your progress is synced across all your devices, so you pick up right where you left off.
It's no wonder Babbel is the #1 selling language app in the world. Babbel offers lessons in 14 different languages, including Spanish, French, and German. So go see if Babbel has the language you want to learn this summer and try it for free by downloading the Babbel app or going to babbel.com.
That's babbel.com. BABBEL.com.
Most of us only hear about the nice stories about an industry or organization.
Well, who wants to air their dirty laundry?
Yeah, that, and we all like a happy ending to things, especially Hollywood. But as we've come to learn on this show, the universe seems to strive for a balance of light and dark, of good people and bad, and therefore, you can't have one without the other. So it must logically follow that with all of our beloved institutions, there's the positive side we celebrate and enjoy, but there must also be a negative side, one of darkness, tragedy, and pain.
And that's exactly what this original new show from Parcast is all about, called The Dark Side Of. Every week, The Dark Side Of pulls back the curtain to bring you the most salacious stories and disturbing details behind everything we hold most dear, and that most of us are totally unaware of.
Episodes of The Dark Side Of take seemingly innocuous topics and expose the dirty secrets that you were never meant to know.
You'll learn the dark side of Hollywood, where on the set of The Wizard of Oz, numerous accidents sent actors to the hospital, and director and Nazi sympathizer Victor Fleming reportedly beat Judy Garland.
We've all heard rumors about the dark side of the music industry, but did you know that Elvis Presley was so obsessed with death that he brought friends to a mortuary at 3 a.m. just to look at corpses?
And of course, there's the dark side of the Bible, which contains stories of demonic giants, unicorns, and child sacrifice, and you don't usually hear about that in a service.
You've heard the good side. Now hear the dark side of.
Search for and subscribe to The Dark Side Of on Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Again, search The Dark Side Of or visit parcast.com/darkside to listen now.
Hi, this is Kalen Capson from the Pagan Plays podcast. When I'm not busy interviewing guests and editing musicians, I'm listening to Astonishing Legends. Now let's get back to the show.
All right, so now I want to come back around to the idea of Bob Hieronymus wearing a costume, because this is the probably the highest profile accusation of a hoax there is out there. I want to go back to how I said a few minutes ago, how I thought it was possible that everyone in this story might be telling the truth or a form of it. And by everyone, I mean Roger Patterson, Bob Gimlin, and Bob Hieronymus. We know for a fact that Roger was trying to film some sort of documentary or docudrama, that he was trying to raise money to fund a proper Bigfoot expedition to look for Bigfoot. And it was his idea that he could do this by creating a documentary film about the sightings and the various things that were happening and putting that together and using it to get money to further fund operations to go actually get evidence of Bigfoot.
That's been reported in Greg Long's book by interviews with people that Roger was trying to get them together.
Jerry Lee Merritt, the musician who was friends with Roger, in his interview with Greg Long, he stated that that was a goal.
People have asked, what's the proof other than Greg Long in his interviews? But there is a photo that he has in his book, I believe, that has Bob Gimlin dressed in a long-haired wig.
Yes, because he was dressed as a tracker, an Apache. He is a quarter Apache, but he had like a full-blown
Native American wig on him, and he was going to be the wise Indian tracker along with the old-timer prospector that were leading these gentlemen in this quest to find a Bigfoot or Bigfoot evidence, and that was the basis of the story. Now, but we don't know how far they got really in the filming other than maybe staging some scenes, right?
Right. So that's the question. Was Roger trying to do an early version of Monster Quest, get a Bigfoot on film to drum up interest in an expedition? Why wouldn't he do that? We actually did the same thing, sort of, when we launched our Patreon page, albeit for comedy, which is debatable if that part worked. But my point is, we bought a Bigfoot suit. We put our friend and early guest of the show, Mark DeAndre, in it, and we made a video asking for Patreon support. It's still up there. You can find it at patreon.com/astonishinglegends. Now, but does that mean if we go out in the woods, which is entirely possible that we might do at some point in the future,
Doubtful,
and try to get evidence of Bigfoot or something unexplained like that on camera, does that mean just because at one point in the past we had a costume and we did that funny bit for Patreon, does that mean we can never be trusted again? That everything we shoot for the rest of our lives is fake?
Probably.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
that's how people think. But
that's how people think, exactly. Yeah. But, what if Roger did buy a costume from Philip Morris's company in Charlotte? What if he asked Bob Hieronymus to wear it? He filmed it, and then he had to discard what he shot because it looked like everyone else who's tried to fake the Patty footage. It looked completely absurd. So maybe it was shot or tested, but never shown or used. Now, Bill Munns in his interview mentioned a man named Kimball, who in 1967 or 68 saw some footage of a guy in an ape suit that Roger Patterson supposedly brought in. Now, everyone looked at it and they all laughed. And this man, Kimball, said that it was the Patterson film. He was talking, he's sure that it was the Patterson-Gimlin film, and he had knowledge of film and film processing. He said that the film stock was a different kind of film stock from what we know the PGF is. He also said it looked like it was processed in what they call hot soup, which is when you adjust the chemicals to bring up the exposure of the film because it was shot too dark. Hot soup would have made the film extra grainy. The PGF is not grainy. Bill Munns will tell you that. He's scanned it at 5K. Kimball also talked about forced zooms, etc., like fake panic baked into how it was shot. That's not really what we're seeing in the PGF. And additionally, he seemed to think that it was shot on a different kind of camera, possibly an Arriflex. So none of anything about that film that Kimball saw lines up with the PGF. So what does that mean? Munns thought that maybe Kimball saw Bob Hieronymus in an ape suit from Philip Morris that Roger Patterson shot, and I'm with Munns on this. This would mean that Bob Hieronymus is telling the truth. He did wear a suit. Philip Morris is telling the truth. He did sell a suit to Roger Patterson. That means Bob Hieronymus did put on a suit. He did walk in it for a film test, and that means he can tell the truth. And the only thing about his story that might not quite be true was if it was the footage from Bluff Creek, which you would have to then suppose that he is either lying about or he's convinced himself that he was the guy in that footage because he didn't come forward until 20 years later, or, he didn't publicly state that he was the guy in the costume until 20 years later. Maybe he's misremembering it. On the other hand, Bob Gimlin said very clearly in Fresno that Roger owed Bob Hieronymus money, and Bob Hieronymus was going to get that money one way or the other. So there's a lot of
or
reasons,
get even.
Yeah, or get even. It was all going to come out in the wash. So that allows Bob Hieronymus and Roger Patterson to both pass lie detector tests because in a way, they're both telling the truth. And what that would mean is that Roger shot that stuff for that film and then he was hoping to use it because he's trying to make his film to drum up money for the expedition. And the Bigfoot part of it was ridiculous. And he wound up not using that footage. And he may have never even told his wife about it because it was such a disaster and a waste of time and money when you think about the cost of the costume and also the film and then the processing of the film and however much time it took to go out and shoot that. If he does that before him and Bob Gimlin come across Patty in Bluff Creek, then you get a scenario where everyone is all telling a version of a truth that is pretty accurate. Philip Morris, Bob Hieronymus, Roger Patterson, and Bob Gimlin. So I just want to point that out, and that's where I currently am falling on the theory line.
So you're going with the hypothesis that Roger Patterson actually bought a suit from Philip Morris for Bob Hieronymus to wear, and he wore it at some point for some filming.
Yes, and Roger Patterson called Philip Morris back and said, how can I make this look better? How can I make it look more real? And then maybe he did some changes to that suit, and then they filmed it, and it looked absurd, and they discarded the whole idea of it.
That's a better solution than maybe a homemade suit, and maybe there were both. I just think that suit at the time was way too expensive for Roger Patterson because he could have bought a 16mm camera for a third of the price.
This is the perfect segue into my next section about Roger's character. He may have purchased it on credit. He was notorious for getting things he couldn't quite afford.
Right.
Or maybe he was going to rent it and return it. Whatever the reason was, of course, I believe that Morris said that he sold it to them.
And two things about that then. Philip Morris never said that Roger owed him for the suit, that it was purchased. And secondly, Bob Hieronymus never said that he filmed anything prior to the Bluff Creek Patterson-Gimlin film. He never mentioned that, we went out and did some tests a couple of years earlier, because that idea with Roger Patterson was a couple of years before the PGF happened.
Right.
So you would think Bob Hieronymus would say and include that, not forget that, like, oh yeah, well, we also
no, he
have this
would
other
not
suit.
if he knows that it wasn't him at Bluff Creek, but he wants to maintain the idea and the story that it was him at Bluff Creek.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Then he's lying by omission about earlier filming.
Possibly, allegedly.
Again, we don't know. It's just that I don't believe I've ever come across anything where Bob said that he had shot some other stuff. So something's not right about that story. Well, a lot of it for me is not right about that story.
Why would Bob Hieronymus say something to undermine his own story, even if he knew it?
Not to undermine it. I think it strengthens it because he could say, like, Roger shot other footage of me earlier wearing a Bigfoot costume. He was really into this. And the PGF was me there at Bluff Creek doing the same thing. You know what I'm saying here is that it doesn't matter one way or the other, but if it happened, though, well, what I'm saying is if it happened, why not include that in your making up of the Bluff Creek story as well?
Well, because the other footage doesn't exist, and it's an even harder thing to prove. To me, what this footage exists, and he can just say it was him in that footage in the costume there.
Right. So what we know, though, is that there's footage, to me, to the logical person, which does not look like Bob Hieronymus in a suit. Okay, that's what he's claiming is real.
Right.
He's not claiming the other stuff, which might be real. Well, there's no proof of that. You know what I'm saying? But you don't have that footage to compare to.
Right.
So what I'm saying is that if it really happened that he was filmed a few years earlier, and more likely to me, wearing some kind of costume then that Roger made at home, because that's what he could afford, maybe out of that horse hide, that stinky red horse hide. And it was really goofy looking because Roger made it himself. Roger had some artistic ability, but there's no evidence that he was a really good costume maker by any stretch.
Right.
So he makes this goofy suit, and maybe, like Bob Hieronymus claimed, it is fur glued over a football helmet.
Well, you're making a really good point here that I hadn't thought of until just now, so I'm glad you brought this up. The natural progression of events for Roger, if he was trying to film or some sort of reenactment or glimpses of a Bigfoot for the documentary that he wanted to do to raise these funds, would be first to try and make one, and then when that one failed miserably, to maybe buy one from somebody like Philip Morris.
Right.
So those could all be existing scenarios, which I think it's really good that you brought that up. But I still don't agree with you that Bob Hieronymus would point out that all that stuff happened.
No,
I see why you would say that. I can get there with you on it. But
no, the easier thing to do is just point to the one incident.
Right.
If it was true, because for the person that's going to create a lie, it's easier, as all liars will tell you, to incorporate a lot of truths into that bigger lie, because it buoys the rest of it. I'm not saying that he's thought this all out. That's all speculation, of course, on my part. I'm just saying if it was true.
Yeah, I don't know if that's where Hieronymus's head is at strategically.
Right. No, I get that.
And how this unfolded. And also, the other films don't exist. And then if you say the other film does exist, then you're opening the door to people saying, oh, the Philip Morris costume was in the other one. This one isn't a costume.
Right.
He would be opening that door if he said that. I wore this
Right.
costume. If Hieronymus came out and said, he made one out of horsehair. We tried that. I looked like a man in a potato sack. It was
Right.
ridiculous. Then he decided that he was going to buy one. So he bought one from Philip Morris. We put that on and people laughed about it. And so that one was ridiculous too. So then we got an even better one. Where would that one have come from? He couldn't have done that.
No,
you know?
but Bob Hieronymus never said that either. He
No, he
never
didn't say
said
anything.
he never said he put on a store-bought suit. He said he put on a several-piece suit that Roger made.
Right.
That was his claim specifically. Not that this was a really good suit that Roger bought from some really good costume maker.
I get all that, but I would also suggest that there wasn't a whole lot of cross-communication going on between the players. I don't know.
Especially if it was made up.
Yeah, well, if it's made up, but
that's
I
my
also
point,
don't
yeah.
think that Roger would have said, this is where I got this suit and da-da-da-da.
Well,
I think, and also,
obviously.
I don't think Bob Hieronymus would have necessarily ever even seen the film. If Roger says, here, come out here for a day, I want to pay you some money, which he probably never paid him because Roger didn't pay a lot of people. Bob Gimlin said he still owed him money, but
Yeah.
come out here, do this. I'm going to film you, whatever. And we know this. I know this from when you film something, when you're an independent filmmaker, because you and I have both been in that boat. We know lots of people that do it, even to this day. A lot of times you don't ever see the thing you were in. Especially if you ask somebody to come do a thing for a day rate, whatever, you
Right.
go away. They're not all involved in the whole process. It's just a body in a suit,
Yeah.
actor meet.
No, I know. All I'm saying is that, well, I didn't look at what questions Bob Hieronymus was actually asked by the polygraph administrator who gave him the test, because I'm sure, as people know, you don't give a long answer in your polygraph. Those are yes or no
Yes
questions.
or no question.
So were you the person in this suit at Bluff Creek on this date? And he must have passed that part,
Yes.
specifically, not like, did you ever wear a Bigfoot costume? Yes. Were you the guy on this date? I have to believe that it got very specific to that incident, and he must have passed. But I will only go by what Bob Hieronymus has said and his description of the costume, which was nothing like the Philip Morris suit, and that it was stinky. It was made out of a red horsehide that Roger skinned out, and he had a football helmet on, which I'm going to guess the only thing that would look decent would be those old leather helmet ones, which are closer to the head and not as ridiculous, that Roger glued some fur on top of that, and Bob brought a spare glass eye to use so he could turn to the camera right at that moment and it would look real.
It wasn't spare. It was one he was using, I think.
No.
Was it? Was it a spare one?
Yeah,
Oh,
because
okay.
he mashed it in there with
okay.
some clay.
I forgot it was spare.
No, see, that was the idea, is that he had one over that he mashed
That's a
into
very
the eye socket.
detail-specific story.
It's a weird thing.
Yeah.
It's a weird thing to include, that he just, like at the last moment, like, hey, Raj, let me try this.
Right. So what you're
and-
saying is,
yeah.
from my theory that you have just deconstructed live
Yes.
on the air,
Well,
the component of it that doesn't work for you, and I see your point, is
Right.
the Philip Morris part. It's that.
that's one of them.
Yeah.
No, it's all of it, actually.
What's wrong with the other part? That that this costume was made and shot and then not used because it looked bad.
That's all possible. I definitely think that, yeah, it's a possibility that should be considered, that he put on some kind of costume in the past. I don't think a Philip Morris costume in the past. I think if it looked goofy, it was more likely than something that Roger made. That's what the guys were laughing at. If it was a Philip Morris costume, which are pretty good, then it would look more authentic. And people are like, oh, that looks kind of scary. That's a big old ape in the woods. What I'm saying is that that's a possibility that should be considered. But I just find it odd that the story that Bob Hieronymus sticks to doesn't mention any of that. And I get your points why you wouldn't want to. You're introducing other stuff. But if it was true, why not add that? Because I just see that as logically saying, Roger did this before. There's 6 other guys that'll tell you that, because we all went out in the woods and he tried to stage this.
My counterpoint to that is,
Yeah.
I think it's possible that Bob thinks he was the guy in the suit for the PGF at Bluff Creek. Because if it's all those years earlier and he goes out a few times, and what he wants to talk about is how he's the guy in the famous film for a variety of reasons, not the least of which being owed $1,000, according to him.
Right.
I just think that there's no reason for him to mention all these other incidents that there's absolutely zero evidence of. And then on top of that, if he says I'm the guy in the PGF film, which was his primary goal, and then he starts introducing all this other stuff after the fact, and, I should have said that, the wit under the staircase thing, it's too late to do that, because then you're undermining your own story when you start adding and changing things after the first statement you made.
I suppose. I'll just say that I don't think that it's any type of misremembering or early dementia or something where he just kind of came to believe he was really the guy at Bluff Creek.
I think that's possible.
It's-
I think
it's
it's
a-
possible
it's
that he
possible.
told himself that over and over and over for years and years and years. That's a proven phenomenon. I've done it myself with much smaller white lies.
But it's
where you
yeah.
convince yourself that that was you because 85% of it is actually something that did happen to you. And then you add a little something to it and you tell it to yourself over and over and to other people. And eventually you get to a point where you're like, no, that is what happened, especially the older you get and your mind
Right.
starts rearranging the furniture. I believe that that is entirely possible with the case of Bob Hieronymus, especially if he had gone out and put a suit on for Roger Patterson and been filmed in that suit and then started to piece all this together and come out about it 20 years later after telling all his friends in bars for decades that it was him in the suit and him in the suit. And then, you know what? It was me in the suit. You know what? It was me in the suit at Bluff Creek. Really? Yes, that was me.
But all total speculation.
Indeed.
Right.
Every single
Every
component
stitch
of
this.
it, which is the
Yeah.
case of all my theories here and my
Sure.
conclusions.
Okay, very good.
All right. So moving on to talk about Roger's character, Patterson's character, and sort of the assassination of it in a way by Greg Long in his book. There was a lot of things in the book about how Roger wanted to make money. Making money is not a crime. Anybody who needs food and shelter that lives in a capitalist society wants to make money because they need to eat and provide for their family. I do think that Roger was determined, if not obsessed, with proving that Bigfoot was real. And I also think that was based on actual experiences he had that he didn't have evidence of. I think that his quest to film Patty was born out of an experience he had earlier that he did not gather evidence of or proof of. And he had castings and he said that he had encounters. And I think he became obsessed with proving to the rest of the world that what he saw the first time that he didn't get any evidence of was real. So to me, I think that's what set him on this mission, was proving that something that he saw was in fact a real thing.
Well, it's like any researcher in the field. You get a piece of evidence, and some people hear stuff and they file it away, or it just becomes an interesting story to tell around the campfire. Same thing with ghosts. Some people have a ghost encounter they believe is real, and it's like, wow, I don't know what that was, but that's an interesting story I can tell to friends, or maybe not, because they'll think you're crazy. And some people have an experience and they become paranormal investigators. And
Right.
write books and go for the rest of their lives on these ghost hunts and continue to be active in the field. Same thing with cryptids and Bigfoot. And Roger was one of those people that I believe, well, he said that he'd heard Bigfoot cries. And that was what was funny, is that maybe they were real. It was some kind of strange Bigfoot call, because remember, it was Ray Wallace had played them some recordings, I think on a cassette tape.
Yes.
And Roger goes, oh, that doesn't really sound like anything, because it was probably Ray Wallace screaming out in the woods, or his wife, trying to fake stuff.
Right.
And maybe Roger had something that was more authentic. That sounded like a big guttural ape call. It's like, well, that's not really what we've got, but okay.
Yes,
authentic,
and just to
but-
remind everybody about Ray Wallace, this is the guy that made the fake Bigfoot
Yes.
track, he made the molds or wood carvings and then went out and left tracks all over the place.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was his big claim, and continued for years to do that.
Yeah.
But in Roger's case, I believe you're right in that he had some experience out in the woods. A lot of people do eventually spend enough time in the woods. It's not that common still. It's a small percentage of people, but we've got a lot of stories just from people, knew of people or had their own experience of something weird. And it's usually never a full-on sighting, but tree knocking, rocks being thrown near people while they're out, all these common things that people have heard, grunting. It's all the same kind of stuff. So I believe this may have happened to Roger. Well, he said he had a little bit of experience with that, and he got the gold bug. He got bit, and he was just really interested from then on. But I don't think so much so as we see with other stories that we wonder about, that people have a small experience where they gather some decent evidence, and then to keep that generating interest, maybe fake a few things.
Yes.
And their conviction is that, well, I really did see some stuff, and maybe I have to fake some things.
We've seen that more than a few
Yeah.
times. The
Yeah.
first incident seems like something that really happened, and then for whatever personality tick or whatever for the experiencer, it's like, I need more people to believe this, so then they hoax secondary and tertiary events.
Yeah.
Or they like the attention they've gotten that they've never gotten before.
Right.
And they continue to fabricate things to kind of stay in the limelight on that
Yeah.
scenario. So yeah,
I mean,
that happens.
Right. So I don't know if Roger actually faked some of those castings that he had, but he was definitely there on some investigations in southern Washington state, as we said before, that were investigated by other serious people that obviously Roger did not create. So he was interested in the phenomenon for years after, until his death, and it was a lifelong passion. You're right. It's something that he thought, hey, if I can capture evidence or maybe film one even, Or maybe make a documentary, some aspect of this where I'm fulfilling a passion that I'm really fascinated by and make a bunch of money, so much the better. But it doesn't seem very likely that he got all this together to stage a hoax for making a bunch of money because, again, it's just a minute of film.
So moving on, just briefly, I wanted to mention something that Jorma Taccone said when we had him on about playing Chaka in the Land of the Lost movie. It was a quote that stood out in his interview with us where he said, longer hair lets you get away with more. And the first thing I thought when he said that, and that's something he obviously learned from being on the film and wearing costume, was that Patty's hair is not really all that long. She does not look like Chewbacca. The hair is short, more like what you would see on a silverback or a gorilla of some kind. And something else that Bob described to us in person about her was that the fur was worn away in the areas that it should be, from the arm swinging or other friction areas that come naturally from body movement.
Well, it's just like your little dog, Lou. You know, her fur is very thin, and you can see where her joints are, where her legs are, and on the belly.
Yeah.
So it's not like the fur on her back, because that's where a lot of movement is. So if you look at Patty, if you look at the film carefully, it does look silvery, or that you can see lighter colored skin on the sides where the arms are moving, because again, that's a high friction area. So again, if it's a suit, it's a very clever and accurate addition to the suit being accurate.
I also want to point out, since this podcast is a matter of record on the PGF film, about the location, I just want to make it clear that the location of Bluff Creek has been positively identified, analyzed, scanned. The actual trees that were in the film have been found. There's no question that the film was shot in Bluff Creek. I want that to be absolutely clear. It was definitely not shot in Yakima or anywhere else for that matter. So if the film was a hoax, we can definitively say that the location itself was not a hoax, and we know that for a fact. We talked about Ray Wallace a minute ago. Is it possible that he made the 3 sets of tracks that drew Roger Patterson to the area? Were those tracks fake? They were the ones around the construction equipment that I believe got back to Roger Patterson's wife, Patricia, who later said, here's the story that I heard. You should go down to Bluff Creek and check this out. And so there's that possibility that drew him to the area. And that gets us to back to the whole Jose Chunks from Outer Space X-Files episode about the idea of fakery being intermixed with what ultimately wound up being a real experience. And I want to touch on that again, is that if Bigfoot is real and there's frequent sightings in this area, and then you also have people like Ray Wallace in the area making fake tracks, there's nothing that says those two things can't coexist, other than, if for you personally, the possibility that Bigfoot doesn't exist. But if Bigfoot might exist, then there's no reason why someone making fake Bigfoot tracks, especially out alone in the woods, might actually even bump into a Bigfoot, at which point the real Bigfoot might get mad and be like, what are you doing?
Well, maybe they'd be curious about seeing other tracks that weren't theirs.
Yeah.
Because one thing that Ray Wallace, as far as I've read, never mentioned was that he had different and varying sizes of big wooden feet that he had a friend carve for him.
Yes.
Maybe he did. That would certainly be a clever thing to add, is that there's a junior, a mama, and it's the 3 bears, and that there's 3 various sizes. But I didn't see anything where Ray said that he had different variations of feet or different sizes, and there were 3 different sizes of feet found around the area. Now, the ones that were found around the bulldozer that Ray Wallace was trying to, I guess, prank one of his machine operator workers for him, because Ray Wallace, I believe, owned the company that was up there. So it's the boss doing some shenanigans up there. And like I said, that would be something I might even do. Not nowadays because it's a thing, but like, it's just a kind of a funny, like, what barefoot giant made these?
I just read a thing on Reddit 2 days ago. It was probably a repost anyway, but it was about a guy who for a long time put on these giant penguin feet and marched all around on this beach.
Yeah.
And I guess for like a decade, I don't know, I'm sure I'm getting the figures wrong, everybody thought there was a huge 80-pound penguin.
Yeah, exactly. No, that I read that.
He came clean.
Right, I read that. I mean, that's good-natured. It's, maybe you're wasting people's time and that they're checking that out, but it's kind of funny to think there's a 12-foot tall penguin somewhere walking around. So I could see a guy who's just a fun-loving prankster to strap that on, but there's been other things about the tracks found that don't seem to match up with what Ray Wallace has claimed. And again, I'll state this from my previous statements, is that Ray Wallace never said he was involved in any way with the PGF.
That's a good point. All right, well, I'm going to get down to my 3 hoax possibility theories. I think you had 2, Forrest. I got one more than you. But,
good for you.
But I think 2 of mine are similar to yours.
Okay.
One of them is that Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin were both in on this hoax. It was carefully orchestrated and planned out, and this would also involve a third party in a Bigfoot costume. That means they planned the location, the costume, the mime, or the person playing Patty, the fact that it would be a single take at the end of a roll of film, the realism of Roger frantically chasing Patty for the shot, the attempts after the fact to bring in tracking dogs, the attempts to have scientists look at the film, all of that is all part of the hoax. Bob Gimlin being so tired from the trek out and the fact that the truck almost slid down in a mudslide with the horses in the back and everything, he was so tired from that return trip home that he actually slept rather than come to the first screening of the film. All of that would be just cover for the fact that this was a hoax. And also, you know what else would be cover is Bob saying that Roger had told him, don't leave me here. I'm out of film. The horse ran off with my rifle, because Roger was concerned with those 3 sets of tracks that brought them to the area that there was another adult there, probably larger, because if they saw the mama bear, daddy bear is bigger and badder and madder. And then also there's a kid maybe somewhere. So where are those? Roger, all he has is an empty film camera to defend himself, so he doesn't particularly want Bob to go off tracking this creature, but that's a made-up statement because the creature isn't a creature at all, but it's someone that they hired to be in a costume. So that would mean that Bob Hieronymus, if you get past all the stuff we've already said about how the costume doesn't seem to work for him, but let's say it did and it was him in the costume, that would mean that he would have to stand there and they would have to get this perfect film in a single take and or destroy other film that didn't work, which would be weird because the exposed footage prior to the Patty film is just normal trail footage that they had that they were filming when they were out there.
Because you'd have to shoot 70 feet, I guess. Well,
so, yeah, it was like 75 feet. Yeah.
Right, of just normal, what they call the horseback footage. And, Bill Munn's also stitched that together so you can see an interesting panorama of the scenery.
Yes.
Which is on our website, too. We took that from the Bill Munn's website where he's just knitted those together. So you can kind of see it's very rough terrain around there.
Right.
Logging roads and kind of torn up landscape there that they were riding their horses around. So they planned it. Again, that's ingenious.
Yes.
To fake that 70 feet first and then have this at the very end because there's no edits. It was all processed in one piece of film. So they would have had to shoot that. And then maybe they rehearsed it. Maybe they had Bob do the walk and they rehearsed how he was going to jump off the horse and
then they got
up.
the perfect take in one take at the end of a 100-foot roll of film on the last 25 feet.
Right. Or maybe they shot 10 rolls where they tried that.
Yes, but then for all 10 of those rolls, did they shoot 75 feet of them just hanging out and riding horses on the first part of all of those?
They would have had to.
They knew that would be more convincing?
Yeah, they would have had
to. They did
all
all that, right? And then on top of that, there's another person out there.
Right.
Bob Hieronymus or someone else who came with them and they staged this whole thing. And that person has remained remarkably quiet, unless it's Bob Hieronymus, for their whole lives.
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't add up to me. That's with them both being in on it. There's also the idea that Roger hoaxed it and Bob Gimlin didn't know about it. And this would be brilliant. Fresh from the mind of a man whose prior endeavors to produce income involved building tiny carts for small animals to pull for children at fairs, Roger came up with this plan to get someone, maybe Bob Hieronymus, to wear a costume, lay in wait on the trail a few miles upriver from their camp, staying hidden as Bob Gimlin and Roger rode up. This guy, Bob Hieronymus, or someone else, then pops out and walks as Patty did to convince Bob Gimlin, the only person that didn't know what was happening, that they had just happened upon a real Bigfoot. That's a possibility there. The thing about this is, and by the way, I'm leaving out the possibility that Bob Gimlin might have hoaxed Roger. And there's 2 reasons that I'm leaving that off the table. One was that Bob Gimlin was completely iced out of profiting from the film after it was shot.
Right.
Why would he mastermind something and then allow himself to be sidelined, going so far later as to sell his court-awarded 51% ownership stake in the film to Renee DeHinden for just a few token dollars? Doesn't make sense. And this is the other reason. We've met Bob. He's an honest man. I would stake my reputation on that. I do not believe that Bob Gimlin is lying.
Wait, your reputation is worth something?
I think so.
Okay,
Well,
we'll go with that.
My son thinks I'm pretty cool.
No, that's nice. No, once you talk to somebody, it never seemed like Bob Gimlin had any interest in furthering or being a part of this at all. As we said before, he was only able to take that time off because his hot mopping a roof.
That's dealing with hot tar, by the way.
Yeah, and a mop, and it's hot, and you're doing it in the late of summer. So they were getting laid off. That's the only reason he had time to go on this, because he wasn't going to take time off from work.
Right. He just happened to bump into Roger in a parking lot because he saw Roger's truck, and it was like a Plymouth pickup truck, which to him was an anomaly. He was like, Plymouth makes trucks. He's looking at it. And then Roger comes up, and the impression that you get from Bob was they actually hadn't seen each other in a while. It's just like, you know, you have friends, you go a few years, everybody's working, doing stuff. They hadn't seen each other in a while. And he comes up and says, hey, you know, and they reconnected. And then that's what led to Bob saying, yeah, sure, I'll go Bigfoot. I don't know, whatever. I'll go with you. It was that kind of thing, you know. And also Roger offered Bob Gimlin some money, which Bob said the other night he's still waiting on. But
right.
It just doesn't feel like this well-orchestrated thing. And so that's the other thing there. Then there's one last possibility in my mind, and that is that someone hoaxed both Roger and Bob. And maybe that would be Ray Wallace or someone else who knew they were coming up there. And this is the only possibility that I think could be real, the only possibility for a hoax. But I still also personally, I feel like it's highly, highly unlikely because as I said, I believe Bob Gimlin is an honest man. I believe Bob Gimlin believes he saw a living, breathing creature. And that's, again, quoting Bill Munn's just as it appears. I believe Roger Patterson might have been a schemer, but I also think he had a good heart. Even when Greg Long seemingly tried to force Al Diatley to declare Roger a shyster in his book, The Making of Bigfoot, Al refused to say Roger didn't have any integrity. All right, here's Greg Long just leading into, it's a little bit out of context. If you want to read all of this, you need to go to page 244 of The Making of Bigfoot, The Inside Story by Greg Long. This is from the hardcover copy of his book. This is Greg Long speaking. I'm going to be frank with you because I've talked to a lot of people. A theme that runs through these interviews, Roger Patterson wasn't a terribly honest guy. Al Diatley responds, I'm not going to call him dishonest, but Greg Long interrupts. Well, let's put it this way. Lack of integrity, maybe? And Diatley responds, well, his integrity was always in place by the fact that, don't worry about it. I'll always pay you back. And he always was going to pay you back, he said, as his smile turned into a sardonic grin. When he got rich, and he always had a get-rich scheme running. And I was involved in 3 of them. He was a good salesman. All right, so that's my point. This says something about Roger to me, but it also says something about Al not feeling comfortable saying that Roger was dishonest.
Yeah.
Roger, maybe he didn't have the money to do all the things he wanted to do and that he was a dreamer. Because what I'm seeing here in this interview is I believe in his heart, Roger fully intended to pay all the people he said he was going to pay.
Right.
And that's a far different thing from this crazy, flim-flam artist going around making a living, completely tricking everybody his whole life into being parted with their money.
Yeah.
It's a different kind of person.
Earlier, before the film, it wasn't a con that was making much money anyway. It wasn't like, I found the golden goose. It's this Bigfoot game. I'm going to keep putting out Bigfoot stuff. I mean, other than Ray Wallace doing it for a laugh, trying to fool people and make posters and all kinds of stuff, but whatever. But with Roger, there was never the sense, though, that he found a gold mine here that just kept paying off, that this was a Bigfoot slot machine. And so he was bilking people and on the run and cheating creditors and all that kind of stuff. He was very small time. He just had this dream. And he put out that book, which was a collection of stories just the year before, which wasn't making him a whole lot of money. It wasn't a number 1 bestseller. And then now he's got to pump that up with a film. It's just that he was interested in it. And I could see here, though, kind of the tone that some people who've been interviewed for Greg Long's book have complained about. In that, that's not exactly what I was getting at. Not exactly that you're putting words in my mouth, but you're shading the tone a little.
And the thing that I will say in Greg Long's favor is that he's remarkably transparent about his efforts to lead the conversations because he's got all that stuff in his book too.
Yeah, I suppose so.
Just I wanted him to say that Roger was shady, but he wouldn't.
But
then I said this, and I'm paraphrasing and making a joke, but still,
you got to go back to the end result of what's in the film. And Roger, again, who never had really 2 nickels to rub together, How's he pulling that off? Is it just happenstance? He just really got lucky.
That brings me back to my point of a third-party hoaxer, because in my heart of hearts, I believe Bob Gimlin is an honest man, and I never met Roger, but from what I've learned about Roger, I don't think he was necessarily the most perfectly honest guy, but I don't think he had a bad heart. And so I think that for me, it seems more likely that if it is a hoax, it's a third party. So that would be a true mythical master hoaxer who knew, because it was no secret really, that Roger and Bob Gimlin were up there, going up there and looking around. They'd been out there 20 days when they shot the Bluff Creek footage. This guy procured the ultimate costume, laid in wait for them to ride up on their horses, all in hopes of convincing Roger, a man who seemed obsessed, an overused word, but appropriate here, with proving Bigfoot existed, and Bob Gimlin, someone who essentially was like, yeah, sure, I'll go with you, that they had seen a creature. But who would that person be in the costume? It doesn't seem like it would be Ray Wallace. He made fake feet. It's a long way from stomping around by yourself in the woods with fake feet to wearing a full-body costume and standing around in it potentially for hours, waiting for them to ride up so you can walk past them, and hopefully also get away to make it stick. We've already said how hard it would be to make a costume like this. He would do all this just to hopefully trick those two guys. Additionally, whoever it was would have fully been risking getting shot to death.
Yeah, that's my number one logic flaw here is that...
Two guys on horses with rifles.
Well, look, if you're from the area, you know, these guys hunt or whatever, and they're probably going to be carrying long guns, and if you startle them in any way, you're just as likely to get shot.
Yeah, as Bob Gimlin said repeatedly in Fresno, I was a crack shot. He didn't miss.
Yeah.
He did not miss.
No, because a lot of people know if you've grown up in a rural area and you're with outdoorsmen, the rule is you don't startle somebody because you're very likely to get plugged or ventilated, as they'd say up there. So it's very risky to come popping out wearing a big hairy suit because you could most likely be mistaken for a bear. And they don't know if you're being charged or not. So that alone is like, that's really foolhardy for somebody to just jump out at Roger and Bob wearing a big old hairy, what looks like to me a bear suit upon first glance.
But you had made a point about Ray Wallace kind of feeling bad for Roger because he knew Roger was ill and maybe didn't have a long time to live and had this obsession with Bigfoot.
Yeah, that's what was reported by Ray Wallace in that newspaper article that we dug up. Not so much an obituary, but a recap of his life, and that he was a decent guy, Ray Wallace.
Yes.
He loved by his family, very generous man, and we're kind of poking fun, but he loved to have a laugh, and that was his kind of an odd way of doing it. We've all known people who are kind of pranksters who get a laugh out of that. That was just kind of the way he found humor. But also being a decent-hearted person, Ray Wallace did feel sorry for Roger in hearing that his cancer was essentially uncurable. And especially back then, they didn't have all the options we do now. And he did want to give him maybe one last thrill. That's according to Ray Wallace. He said, you go down there and you'll see something. That's the Jose Chung thing. Maybe he did leave footprints and he knew that Roger would find them. But again, he never claimed that, like, you go down there and I'll be wearing a suit, or you'll see somebody in a suit, or you'll just see something. I think he just meant footprints.
And as you said earlier, he claimed he never had anything to do with the Patterson-Gimlin film, even though he came clean about everything else he did while he was alive. With the tracks and everything, he said he never had anything to do with the Patterson-Gimlin film.
That's right.
So that means if it wasn't Ray Wallace, it would have to be somebody else, someone I'm going to call Perpetrator X. Perp X is a genius hoaxer, the likes of which the world has never seen. A person capable of creating a costume in 1967 that has defied 50 years of constantly improving emerging technological analysis of the film. A costume with no seams. A costume that not one single person has ever replicated and filmed in a comparative way that wasn't completely laughable. A costume that has never been found and no equal has ever been displayed in 52 years as of this recording. This is also someone who can keep a secret for 50 years. The ultimate secret of fooling the world for so long with the Patterson-Gimlin film. Someone so stoic and committed to the hoax that they never needed to seek the limelight, or maybe they just died shortly after it was made. A person that must have had a horse hidden somewhere that they hoped to walk back to through the woods so they could take them back to their own truck and maybe trailer where they could get back into street clothes and make a clandestine escape. This is Perp X, and Perp X is perhaps the greatest hoaxer that ever lived, and like the killer of the Black Dahlia, he may never be known. To be clear, this is firmly in the absurd column for me. I would submit that if the Patterson-Gimlin film was a hoax for any of these reasons, Why aren't there more holes in the surrounding story? All of Bob Gimlin's details add up. How full the moon was. Yes, we checked. The weather, the road they took in and out. And Gimlin never offers any facts on things he doesn't know. He'll be the first to say, I wasn't part of that. In a story as elaborate as this one, keeping it all straight would be exceptionally difficult. It would be akin to trying to cover up a murder, especially as much as this has been analyzed. It simply wouldn't hold up, and you can't point to a little fog about how the film was processed as something that brings the entire fabled House of Cards down. We've shown that it only takes, as I said just a few minutes ago, 1 hour to process that film. All you have to do is find the right place. So if it's not one of those three things, a hoax by both Roger and Bob, a hoax by Roger alone, or a hoax by some brilliant third party, then there's only one thing left for Patty to be, and that's real.
I agree. And as you alluded to earlier, my two conclusions logically echo what you just said. Because for me, if you break down the entire story of what we did and all of the research that has been put in by experts and enthusiasts over the years, there are only two possible conclusions to the Patterson-Gimlin film. One, it's either one of the greatest paranormal hoaxes or hoaxes in general ever accomplished that remains undebunked to this day, or two, it's actual footage of a real Bigfoot.
All right, folks, that is the end of our conclusions. It is now time for us to introduce you to Bob Gimlin, quite probably the only living survivor of the Patterson-Gimlin film incident at Bluff Creek. That's presuming Patty has moved on to greener pastures.
Oh, yeah, we don't know.
We don't know, but we do want to tell you a little bit about Bob before we get into him. This guy is tough. If you go to his website, you can get a DVD. It's a documentary that's a life story of him, and it has a lot of background with him and information, and we watched it on the way to Fresno when we went to see him so we could get some good background on him. It is just really fascinating. Forrest, can you briefly recount how Bob Gimlin wound up in the Navy?
Well, as far as I can remember from the DVD, what the story is essentially is that he was with some of his younger buddies there, and they all wanted to serve. But Bob really wanted to be a Marine, and the other guy said, oh, forget that.
They were all drinking, by the way.
Yeah. The Navy life is better. I'm sure the food's better. You're on a ship. You're not trudging, crawling through the mud. The Navy's for us. Like, you should join the Navy. And he's like, no, I really want to join the Marines. But he made them a bet. He said, I'll tell you what, we'll toss a coin. If it's heads, we'll all join the Navy. How's that? But if it's tails, you all have to join the Marines with me. And they flipped the coin, and Bob lost, and he had to go join the Navy. The problem is, the rest of his buddies chickened out, and they did not join the service.
When he showed up to sign up, he was the only one there.
Yeah.
And this, to me, is a hint of Bob's character. He went through with it.
Yeah.
He went ahead because he said he was going to do it, and that's what he did. And if all those other guys welched, well, that's not going to change his character and what he said he would do.
Yeah, so he kept his promise, and he went into the Navy.
The other thing about Bob is he should have been killed several times, and I'll tell you why. One time he was in a horrible car accident. People died in the accident, but he recovered from that. He was laid up in the hospital for quite some time. His legs were badly damaged. The engine flew out of the car or crushed someone else in the car.
I think what happened is that they'd picked up a guy, I think hitchhiking, and they were all riding in the car, and this guy wanted to drive this other guy's car, one of his buddies. And it was somebody, it was not a vagrant. I think it was somebody else of their age or even in the service, and he wanted to drive this car, but he was driving really fast, and I believe Bob was asleep in the back. And next thing they know, this guy, I think, hit a pole.
Yeah.
And it sent the engine all the way back into the car and just tore everybody up.
Yeah, it was not good. Not everybody lived through it, but Bob did.
No, they
barely.
didn't think Bob was going to live.
Yeah.
In fact, I think he heard a doctor saying this guy's got maybe a week or so.
So that's one time Bob should have died. Another time, he spent his whole life riding horses. You hear talk of him being a rodeo man, and yeah, he rode in rodeos, but what he really did for a living was break and train horses. And you can tell even now when you go talk to him, that is his passion. That is what he loves. That's what he did his whole life. So at one point he was out in a circular ring working on a horse, trying to break it, teach it how to behave properly, and it threw him. And not only that, it did it with extreme malice. And then it came back around again and stomped on him, right? I believe.
Yeah, because he'd known this reputation of this horse was cantankerous, not even waspy, which is a term Bob uses
Frequently.
for being skittish. Yeah.
Yes.
But this thing was mean, and he was trying to break it. And I remember as the way he told it is that he pulled back on those reins and it was rearing up on him and then threw him. But what happened is that it bucked him off. And then when he was in midair, this thing back kicked him in the
Yes.
chest and snapped his sternum in midair. Then he's lying on the ground and he's trying to crawl to the house or the exit of the corral, like a 60-footer pen there.
This is the
circular
Bruce
pen.
Lee of horses.
Came back around and trampled him.
So he's about, I think, 85 feet or something, don't quote us on exactly, from his cabin or his house. And he is almost at death's door, but he crawls across the ground over to his house. And I think he has some problem getting inside the door. I can't remember if he even got inside, but then his wife comes home.
He's bleeding,
Yeah, he's
and
bleeding,
his
he can't
chest,
breathe.
his sternum is snapped in half, and he's having trouble breathing. He can't even lift himself up to sit in the chair. At that
Right.
point.
And so his wife says, I'm going to take you to the hospital. And Bob says, no, I don't want to die in a hospital. Don't take me anywhere. Just get me into the bed. And he gets in the bed and waits to die.
Propped up
Sitting
at
up.
this point.
Yeah. So he's in there, I
Right.
think, a couple of days, and it becomes clear that he's not going to die.
Yeah.
At which point he goes to see somebody and they figure out what's wrong with him and he slowly gets nursed back to health. I just want to say again, this is a sign of very stout character and a very tough man. These stories it's not the kind of stories you hear these days
Right.
about people. So I
Well,
think I also want to remind everyone that he was pushed aside by Roger Patterson and probably more specifically Al Diatley when the Patterson-Gimlin film was processed and they wanted to take it on the road to make money off of it. And he got pretty upset about that. But by the same token, it was not great for him and his family. And you'll hear him talk a little bit about that tonight and what his wife went through during this whole ordeal. But even as mad as that made him, when Roger Patterson wound up being on his deathbed just a few years later, Bob buried the hatchet. Again, I think that points a lot to Bob's character and the kind of person he was. Even though he got screwed out of a fair amount of money that was made out of that film, when Roger was dying, he went to visit him in the hospital. I don't think anyone who meets Bob Gimlin can think he's lying about everything that happened. I, for one, no longer believe the Patterson-Gimlin film is a hoax. I believe it's real. And I believe Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin captured the holy grail of Bigfoot evidence, and that for complex psychological reasons, the world at large refuses to accept or believe it. Tonight, you can judge for yourself after you hear our interview with Bob Gimlin. We only had a few minutes with him, and we were using some new gear, so it's going to sound a little different from what you normally hear. We had a field microphone that's new to our portfolio. I'd like to thank Jim Harold for recommending that piece of equipment. Since we only had about 30 minutes with him, it was the end of a long night. He had already been on stage for well over an hour. He's 87 years old and had to get up at 4 a.m. the next morning. We were trying to keep it brief. We asked him not to tell the story again. He's told the story a million times. You can find that story on YouTube. You want to hear him talk about what happened in Bluff Creek? It's on YouTube. But we did ask him some other questions. We're going to finish this series and tonight's episode with Bob Gimlin. We hope you've enjoyed it. We're sitting here with the Bob Gimlin. It's really the chance of a lifetime. We drove up from Los Angeles to see you today, Bob. It's really great to see you, and we appreciate you staying up a little bit late to talk to us. I know you have to get up so early tomorrow.
Well, yeah, that's okay. I mean, get to talk to you guys is a pleasure, and we'll just work with it.
One of the first questions I wanted to ask you about, again, was that feeling you had when you first came upon Patty or before you came upon Patty. Did you have any kind of sense, because I imagine you do, being a tracker and a hunter, sometimes you might sense that something's there before you see it. Did you have anything like that going on?
Well, no, I didn't, because I was just riding along, leisurely riding along, enjoying the weather and enjoying everything. So I didn't really have any sense that was going to have anything happen. You know, went around the bend in the creek there, and there she stood.
For you, when you first saw her, did you have a fight or flight sense, or did you feel threatened, or were you in shock, or were you pretty calm, or how did you feel in that first moment?
Well, I wasn't really too excited, and I didn't get scared because we'd been down there riding many, many miles for almost a month. We'd been down there for 20 days. I just thought, oh, my God, they really do exist.
So it was a revelation for you.
Yes, absolutely.
It's my understanding and our understanding from just research and reading about your experience and everything, it got to a point where I don't think you probably expected everything that came down on you, all the skeptics and that sort of thing, and your wife maybe had asked you to stop talking about it, so you decided to just lay low for a while.
Oh, yeah, definitely, because my wife was really disappointed, and, she'd come home crying and saying, well, I went through a whole bunch of static today about it, and I'd say, honey, just don't pay no attention. She said, I have to. I'm a teller at the bank. And she said, they come up there and start talking to me while I'm working. And I said, oh, yeah. And I felt bad about it, but there was nothing I could do about it, And then when she went to strictly just the bookkeeping part of it, well, then that was kind of a blessing for her.
We just talked to Bill Munns for 2 hours yesterday.
Oh,
and he said to tell you hello, by the way.
Well, my hat comes off to Bill. He's a great guy, and I feel bad about not staying in contact with him, but I just get really busy, and I can't hear. If I don't have my hearing aids in, I can't hear nothing, so I don't do much calling.
Well, that's fine. He didn't seem to have 1 ounce of animosity towards you. He said to tell you hello and that he hoped you were doing well.
Same way. My same thing goes back to Bill because he's a great guy.
Yeah, we really enjoyed his book. And, one of the things that we had discussed with him, and this was what I wanted to ask you about, and Forrest and I both wanted to ask you a little bit about, was do you think there was any possibility, because when you look at all the stories about, the Morrises and the costumes, and also Bob Hieronymus, who you talked a little bit about, do you think there's any possibility that Roger might have had a costume and was trying to film for the docudrama and all that before you guys came across Patty, and it was something that you might not have known about?
Well, it's possible because I didn't have that much time with Roger, and it's possible that this all happened, but I never knew about it. Never knew anything about anything that was going on. The only thing that I remember is when Roger was getting quite a few months before that, he was kind of getting some work done to get a documentary to generate enough revenue to put an expedition down there. And I did some tracking and riding horses for him. And then, of course, that all dropped and he never did finish it up. Didn't bother me none because I was riding the horses anyway, and I'd ride off places where the white guys wouldn't ride, and so I didn't care. I mean, I'd go right straight off the side of a mountain, and the back feet sliding up underneath the nose, and a lot of those guys wouldn't do that, but it didn't bother me. God, I'd done that all in my life.
I want to ask you a tracking question because I know you're a skilled tracker and you had experience in that. And during that time when you had wanted to track her, the impression that we got was that Roger, he was concerned because his horse had ridden off with his gun, and he was maybe wanted to go back and get the plaster or whatever you guys were using to pour the tracks and that sort of thing. But when you were actively tracking her, when you had gone up and you found the wet footprint and all that, what was tracking her like? Was that like, did you feel a little bit like you might were tracking a human, or?
Well, yeah, basically, because it already appeared to be a human-type creature, walking like it did and swinging its arms and everything just appeared to be a human-type creature. And so when we went up and found a half of wet track, it stepped in the creek, of course, and then stepped on a flat rock, and there was half of a track there. And then went right on up through the rocks and the cliff. And I wanted to follow up through there because I could see where it scratched and broke rocks and stuff going up through there. And of course, Roger didn't want me to, and all I want to do is see it again. That's why I wanted to ride after it immediately when it disappeared. And Roger didn't want me to do that because he wanted to get his horse caught up and get more film in the camera. And, there were so many things happened so quick, so much, and we were running short of time. Because up there, in the mountains at 4 o'clock, it's getting a little bit waspy, a little bit late. And so by the time we got down out of there, it would have been pitch dark. So,
did you go back and try and follow the track after, like, Roger got his horse back and you got the pack horse back? And when you were looking at the footprint, did you try and follow it into the brush? Where do you think it went? I mean, I know you said it went kind of up the hill, but...
Well, this is quite a lot. See, there's mountains. The downfall and stuff caused kind of a jam here, and the creek went around. And there's a mountain over here, and a mountain up here, and a mountain back here. Well, pretty steep, not bad. And then this big open place where it walked across. was all bare, and this was up this other creek, tributary of this main creek, part of another little creek that went up to here, and I don't even know. I think it was called Notice Creek. I think that's what Roger called it. I didn't know what it was.
That sounds right. Yeah.
And so I wanted to go, but he didn't want me to go. And so I didn't have a camera or anything. I just wanted to see it again. And so he said, well, let's get back because we got to get some plaster and get the footprints and then do some other research, like jump off the stump with the cowboy boot on and get a indication of how deep it would go into the same soil.
One thing you mentioned tonight was that you felt like when you look back and you think about having made mistakes and that sort of thing, one of them was doing a backtrack. Can you explain what backtracking it would have been, what that actually means?
Well, yes, I can. Backtracking would have been, we would have went back and went where it came from instead of where it went. That was one of the mistakes we made. Instead of going and seeing how it got up to the creek or whether it waded up the creek or what, we didn't because we were so busy doing other things, getting other things done.
When you first saw her, was Roger in your line of sight so that you saw whatever was happening with his horse? You saw him fall, or you did not actually witness that happening?
No, I witnessed all of it.
Yeah.
All of it. Yeah, he was only 3 or 4 horse lengths ahead of me.
And your horse didn't buck. It got kind of, as you said, kind of waspy, but you didn't get thrown or anything.
No. I'd rode a lot of rough horses. And it would have took a pretty good horse to unseat me, when I was like 36 years old.
It did react, though, because because Bob Hieronymus was saying that, well, that was an old trail horse, and he wouldn't have reacted at all. But
he did react a lot, but I stayed on him and kept him under control. Yeah.
Some video we saw of you on YouTube already, and also we watched your film. There was some suggestion that I think in the film, you saw her for a lot longer, obviously, than she was filmed. But that look back, you think that was related to you dismounting?
I'm quite sure it was, because she never made that effort to do that until I started to get off the horse, until I got off the horse.
We had a theory that maybe the horses were not for her perceived really as a threat, and she didn't recognize that humans were there or on them, and then when you separated yourself, that was a new kind of threat to her.
Well, it could have been, it'd all be speculation, but I would imagine that the movement or whatever, and then, and it would have been one unit or one with as long as I was mounted on her. But of course, when Roger was trying to get off his horse, she was just turning to walk away.
With regard to Al Diatley, and as best we can tell, it seems a little bit, you actually used the word on stage tonight, you were talking about somebody else or something else, but opportunistic, it seems a little bit like Al he saw dollar signs with this thing once it was on film, and you kind of got squeezed out of the picture.
Absolutely, yeah. When we came back off the trips and stuff, I said, I got to go back to work and get some money coming in, because all we'd sold is a store to Argosy. And of course, Al always took care of all the money and everything. And he said, well, Bob, I'll give you a third. I was supposed to be a third partner. And the check that he gave me, I was going to buy tires for my car. The check he gave me bounced, so I didn't get nothing out of it.
Do you think Al Diatley was maybe telling Roger what to do, kind of controlling the show?
He definitely was telling Roger what to do, because when Roger on his deathbed apologized to me, he said, it wouldn't have been for Al, I wouldn't have never done that to you, Bob. And so Al was backing Roger money-wise, and everything that Al said, Roger did, because Roger was his brother-in-law.
One of the things that you mentioned near the end of your film, and I actually got a little bit choked up when you talked about it, was just about how you went back to see Roger. You said you couldn't hold a grudge against somebody who was so sick. And one of the things that he was talking about in his dying day was getting tranquilizers and all that sort of thing. I think that's a side of the story a lot of people don't know. Can you tell a little bit about what he was trying to plan?
Well, yeah, Roger was on his dying bed right there, and I kind of knew that. But he said, Bob, I know Al and I really did you dirty. And he said, I've got enough stuff and enough equipment to go down, and he said, as quick as I get well, you and I will go back down there and we'll capture one. And I said, Roger, just get well. He died by the time I got out to my car, because his brother had come up. His brother had come up when I was getting ready to leave, and I got back out to my car, and I was doing something out there and Roger's brother come out and said he died. And I said, what? They traveled with a guy and said he was me, and went all through Midwest and had signs up, well, Bob Gimlin will be here, and they had some guy about my size and everything, and just happened to be that he got called on it from a guy that knew me that was down there. And he got up and he said, you're not Bob Gimlin. He said, I know Bob Gimlin. And they had the security throw him out.
Well, you once said in an interview that maybe it was with the BBC long time ago, a few years ago, that when you were younger, you had no thought that Roger could have fooled you at all. Like you were pretty sure. But then years later, maybe you thought maybe it could have. Do you still feel that way?
That was kind of just an afterthought, because I thought, after I think all the things that happened and how they happened, way back in the mountains, he could have never even pulled off anything. And then when Bill Munns did his book, then I realized that, even I realized it at the time, that there was no sag or anything at all in the fur and the hair or anything. And it walked over uneven ground without even missing a step.
One of the things that I thought was a great question from the audience tonight when everybody was in here and you were here with Jeffrey for Paranormal Central, somebody asked you what you saw. Because one of the things that struck me was also when you first saw the film, you were kind of disappointed because you saw so much more with your eyes. And also that person asked, what did you see with your eyes that you cannot see in the film?
Well, you can't really see the movement of the muscle in the film, and I saw all of that, as it rippled and moved and stepped and changed sizes from the thighs to the shoulders and stuff. That's what I meant when I said that.
And you talked about the lips a little and the bare spots of the fur, right?
Yeah, the rubbed off hair off the side of it where it swing its arms, was small.
It reminds me of a cat. Like when the fur gets real thin, it's like on a cat's head. You can it looks lighter.
Yeah, I noticed that right away, and then I could see the lips kind of moving at one time a little bit, not a whole lot, and then the difference of being able to see something with your eyes and then what's on a film.
You once said that you would never like to experience that again, that whole ordeal. Do you still feel that way? And if you did, would you tell people about it or would you keep it secret?
No, I'll tell you what, I wouldn't really just broadcast it. I would tell the chosen few that really meant something to. And yes, I'd like to have the same experience, but I'd work at it a little bit different. I would try to convince her, don't walk away from me. Try to be able to show some friendship or something without any hostility. Well, there was no hostility. She didn't have any hostility. But we were rushing things. And it was probably against her will and everything that we were rushing. Everything was going fast. Roger was at her with a camera, and I wouldn't have a camera. I'd just say, hey, let's do something. Let's be friendly, smile a lot, and just not have any hostility of thoughts. When I go into the mountains now, I don't even carry a pocket knife. I don't even carry nothing except maybe some fruit or something to give them, apples or pears or anything, or an orange. They seem to like peanut butter on a jelly sandwich. And by golly, I do all those things. And if they throw sticks and stuff at me, I apologize to them. I just say, hey, I'm sorry. And if I'm just talking to myself, I still do that. And I turn around and I leave because I figure that they don't want me in the area. If they're throwing stuff at you, They could kill you if they wanted to with a stick or a rock or whatever, but they don't. They just throw it to spook you, throw bark and pine cones and different things at you. And I've never really ever had it happen to me, but I've talked to a lot of people that has had it happen to them.
What do you say to those folks that say, oh, it's a guy in a costume, this is all a hoax, you've been carrying this on and on forever and ever? What do you say to those folks?
Well, I just say, hey, folks, I'm not trying to convince you that they live and they're out there. Look at the film and make your own judgment. Give it some really serious thought before you make a false statement about it. I just hope and pray that the people who do get to see that will understand that there is no such thing as a man in a suit. If a man in a suit, it'd have wrinkles and it'd have different as it moved. That's what I try to tell folks, I'm not trying to convince you that they live. I know they live. It makes a big difference to me, of how many people out there hear this and whether they believe it or don't believe it. Look at the film and make up your own mind.
That's going to wrap up our series on the Patterson-Gimlin film. We're dark next week, but we'll be back the week after that with special guest parapsychologist Brandon Masulo.
Please remember to support our sponsors. They help keep the show free and the lights on in Blanket Fortiana.
Special thanks to John Bolin.
L-I-U-C. I'm Lucas Taylor, A-S.
Hi, this is Lori McGann.
Hi, I'm Kalen Capson, C-A-P-S-O-N.
N, as in Nancy.
Thank you, folks, for listening. Hey, these guys are great guys. You guys probably already know, you listeners already know these guys better than I do, but they're great guys.
Our show is edited by Sarah Voorhees-Wendell and co-produced by Tess Feifel, who is also our head of research.
Our theme, which is available as a ringtone, was composed by Judson Crane, and our sound design and additional composing is by Ryan McCullough.
Special thanks to the Astonishing Research Corps.
But most importantly, we want to thank you, our listeners. Visit our store at astonishinglegends.com or interact with us and other listeners on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
You can also support the show at patreon.com/astonishinglegends, where patrons have access to additional bonus content. No part of this show may be reproduced anywhere without permission. Copyright Astonishing Legends Productions.
Good night.